Many of my friends tell me that I'm a young man, but I'm afraid all these friends are older than me. I'm in my late 40s, and when you get here, you realize how fast time passes. It seems like just yesterday that I was feeling the oppressive pressures of adulthood and 30, and boom, blink a few times, years have passed. The scarcity of time becomes real, and I guess one way of dealing with this is a modern way of living. Do everything fast, fast, fast. Throw yourself into the world. Spend every waking moment doing something, even if it is only on your smartphone. Life is always moving, but it doesn't go anywhere. It is shallow. I'm not berating others as much as I am lamenting my own choices and the weakness of character that has stopped me from breaking out of this. I want to live a slow life. I want to have long conversations, sit with friends without the pressure of performing for the world. I want to go out, look at the world instead of being lost in my own head. How can we learn to do this? How can we stop throwing ourselves into the chaos around us but just sit back and observe? How do we give ourselves a space to reflect? One way of doing so is to write. If you build a habit of writing, then when you write, you withdraw into a quiet space where life slows down and even becomes clearer. You examine your own thoughts and perhaps even form them. Because by writing every day, you don't just see the world a little better, you also shape your own self. And maybe that's the best way to fight against the relentless march of time.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is my friend Amitava Kumar. Now, where do I start talking about Amitava? He was born in a small town in Bihar in 1963. He did his schooling in Patna, went to college in Delhi, then went to the US where he joined academia and is now a professor of English at Vassar College. He has written many books that are so varied that it is hard for me to describe them in one sentence. There's memoir and personal essays. There's reportage, including about the 2002 Gujarat riots and the Bhagalpur blindings. There is poetry, there are novels, he has written screenplays for documentaries, and his latest book is in a category of its own. It's called The Blue Book, and it contains writing and art by him. He discovered the joy of drawing and painting a few years ago, and he would often juxtapose his art with his writing on his Instagram page. It's like a journal. In fact, it's like a journal from decades past, before the internet, when we weren't always lost in our smartphones, when we had the space to reflect, when we had Tehrav. The Blue Book moved me and inspired me so much. It's full of magical moments, and it's a book I will keep going back to for the rest of my life. I also loved this conversation. Amitava is a highly regarded writing teacher, and I felt I was also learning about life when I spoke to him. Before we get to this conversation, though, a quick plug. Registration is now open for the March cohort of my online writing course, The Art of Clear Writing. Head on over to indiauncut.com/clear writing to register. Even if you're listening to this episode at a later point in time, the course is ongoing, so go to indiauncut.com/clear writing for more details. And listen to this episode. It will inspire you to write more and live better. But first, a commercial break about why you should also read more. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their daily reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees. 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Amitava, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
No, boss, thank you. Long time no see.
Long time. I think it's definitely more than a decade, but yet there is that sense of familiarity, right? Ki,
सही I think it is. I mean, I don't know about you, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि when I was young, because I would think इस साल, 1st January आता था, and I would think इस साल एक short story लिखूंगा. I'm talking about maybe when I was, I don't know, 20. ठीक है? तो उस समय achievements were so scarce, and even once goals were so limited, that the passage of time was always very clear to me कि ये साल बीता, अगला साल शुरू हो रहा है. Now I'll be 22. Now I'll be 23. Maybe this year I will get a girlfriend. वगैरह वगैरह. You know what I'm saying? Now, सालों के साले all collapse together. Time. So this sense of time has also, I don't know, it has just changed in this middle age. Entire eons seem to have vanished. It's all a blur. Magar, I remember that evening we were sitting outside and we were talking, or not to put it in very romantic terms, लेकिन वहाँ सागर की लहरें वगैरह वगैरह in Mumbai.
yeah, it was one of the seaside hotels. I forget which one. शायद Marriott नहीं था उसके बाजू में.
मुझे भी याद नहीं. हाँ.
Yeah.
और सुना.
No, in fact, that's a theme I was going to kind of bring up, which is the compression of time. Like I teach this online writing course, and I teach 4 webinars, and the 4th webinar is about process, where I say I'm going to move past the craft and talk about the process and how you build writing habits and all of that. And the reason that was important to me, which I have shared with participants also, is that I think that is a one area in which I failed, where I say that I look back now, if I did this course in my 20s, I would have learned so much. But this is the most important thing I needed to learn, because in the blink of an eye, 15-20 saal nikal gaye. The time just passed. The 10-20 books I should have written never happened. It all just went. And I was also thinking of this when I was rereading your excellent book, A Matter of Rats, about Patna. And you mentioned Patna's glorious history and, how people confuse Chandragupta II and Chandragupta Maurya and all that. But regardless, you were talking about the glory of the 4th century. I think at one point, Farhine called it the Florence of the East. वो सब था. And I thought कि ठीक है, when I am 20 and I'm looking back, I'm saying कि my God, so many centuries have passed. But when in my own life, already 48 years have passed, a little more in yours, it doesn't seem that long. It seems like, in a sense, it must have been just, you just go back a little bit and you're in a glorious Patna again, you're in Nalanda University again.
So, do you teach in your course कि भाई, how will you stop time, or how will you measure time, or how will you record time? ये आप सिखाते हैं? Do you teach them?
इतनी गहराई में नहीं जाते हैं. Do you mean that in terms of technique, or do you mean it in that broad romantic sense of writing?
I'm thinking, for example, of the occasion for our conversation right now is the Blue Book. It came out of, in some ways, measuring time, recording time. ये जो वक्त बीत रहा है, how to be faithful to it in some ways. यानी कि हम लोग लॉकडाउन में हैं, मान लीजिए, if you talk about that time, how to be faithful to it, and how also to be active and respond to it actively. तो मैं obituaries पर, जैसे न्यूयॉर्क टाइम्स के obituaries पे तस्वीरें बनाने लगा, and I made drawings on these newspapers. I'm trying to say to you that what you and I are agreeing about this passage of time, this blink of time, where these decades, last 18 years, you said, for example, they would have had a different density if we had every night written something or every morning recorded something. Simple. So that is something I am teaching. मैं अभी आपसे लंदन में बात कर रहा हूँ. I have brought 13 of my students from Vassar, where I teach in upstate New York. I have brought them here. And I just sent them the other day an excerpt, 1-2 pages from Sally Rooney's latest book, where a woman called Eileen says that every day she thought she would start a book called The Book of Life, and in which she would record a phrase. जैसे कि, there were leaves blowing on the street. Yeah, today it rained all day. जो भी है. And she says that now when she reads that phrase, it brings back something, the taste of that day. ठीक है? तो मैं अपने स्टूडेंट से कह रहा हूँ कि भाई आप लोग, when you are on the tube, when we are going out, जैसे कि सैटरडे को हम लोग ब्रिक्सटन जा रहे हैं, where the Caribbean community came and stayed, and where there was a riot to protest against police brutality. तो मैं कहूँ कि आप वहाँ जब जाएं तो you write down a phrase or two. मैं तो वो हर खुद कर रहा हूँ, जैसे कि आप I'm talking to you. There's this journal in which I'm writing a few things. You said about time. I wrote about time right there. So that time doesn't seem to. जैसे क्या? Okay. Listen. Can I read to you something that I noted
Please,
the other
please,
day?
please.
I'm listening to Mrinal Pandey talking about her first memory. A procession of people was approaching them. She was a small child. Who are these? The child, Mrinal Pandey, asked. Her elder sister said that they were refugee. तो ये तो तुम्हारे शो पे पढ़ा सुना मैंने उनको.
Yeah,
But that's a little story that I just wanted to note down, especially the way it was articulated in those three. और ये note अगर मैं फिर से आज से 10 साल बाद, if I just pick up my journal and I'm flipping, this little description will bring back to me the entire conversation that I heard between you and Mrinalji. And it will bring back also, I want to insist, it will bring back also the moment of my sitting on this table in a flat in London, and where we were, how my son was here, and my wife was in the other room, etc. समझ रहे ना? And my expectation that soon I too will be talking to my friend Amit Verma. So what I'm trying to say is a practice of writing in a journal, of making a record of things, is the way to mark time. Not to stop it, not to stop time, but to mark it in a way so that all is not lost.
So let's dig a little deeper. One of the things I was, that really struck a chord when I was reading or rereading your books, as it were, is the excellent process advice you gave to yourself. Ki har roj 150 words likho. And in my class, it's 200 words, where I tell these guys that every day just write 200 words. Even if you're, ill, going to the airport, aap smartphone pe likh sakte ho. It's not a big deal. And this sense of the importance of constantly writing is captured beautifully by the Susan Sontag quote in the start of the Blue Book, where she says, "In the journal, I do not just express myself more openly than I could do to any person. I create myself. The journal is a vehicle for my sense of selfhood." And there's a Joan Didion quote I use in my course to talk about the importance of writing, where Didion said, "I do not know what I think until I write it down." Stop quote. And it seems to me that what we do when we write regularly, is that we are not only capturing the moment or that time or the flavor of that time, but we are also deepening our sense of self. That when we write, we are forced to reflect upon what we have seen. When we know we are going to write, we see more deeply and more clearly because we know we are going to write at some point. वो सब कुछ हो जाता है. So is this a sort of a process that you've noticed in yourself? क्या आप मतलब शुरू से ऐसे थे, or was there a point in your life where you gradually began to realize that, my God, this writing is not just about me expressing myself to the world, it's about me shaping myself?
Wow. Yes, that's a very good point. I don't think that realization came till much later. There's a story I think I tell in the Blue Book. Maybe I would have been in the 6th standard in Patna. An uncle of mine was trying to bribe a transport bureaucrat, because he would the bureaucracy worked this way कि भैया वो बंदा बताता आपको कि आपकी बस किस लाइन पे चलेगी, और on some lines you get money, on the others not. Anyway, so he was taken to a restaurant and I was taken with him. And मैं ऊपर जब देखा restaurant के, when I looked at the ceiling, there were these shiny bangles, pieces of bangles embedded in it. और मुझे ख्याल आया कि but how, ये कैसे लिखेंगे इसको कि and maybe I made a link with the fact कि इस होटल का नाम अंबर था और ये स्काई है और ये स्काई बड़ी बैंगल के shimmering stars. तो मुझे लगा I was trying to, how will I write? I very clearly remember thinking about this, and I very also clearly remember the shot of envy and admiration I felt when, just a little while later, in the school magazine, some boy had already described it. Just that sky. So for me, shuru mein, it was more about the question of the self had not entered, which I think you were very right to say is the real point. It was more about finding a language that was adequate to the surroundings I was. And another defining memory is my coming to Delhi after I got a scholarship and coming to study and reading people like Dom Moraes, Khushwant Singh. Because उस समय तक जो पढ़ाई होती थी ना मेरी we had learned or read things where people were describing distant places. इंग्लैंड की डिस्क्रिप्शन हो गई. आई मीन द क्लीशेड स्टोरी अबाउट दिस इज कि भैया सारे देसी लोग या कॉलोनियल्स नो अबाउट डैफोडिल्स, लेकिन जैस्मिन या वो चंपा को किस तरह से डिस्क्राइब करें हम नहीं जानते हैं. खैर, सो देयर सफदरजंग एयरपोर्ट के पास seeing the bats wheeling in the sky and thinking कि इसके बारे में हम कैसे लिखें, इस आकाश के बारे में और इस जानवर के बारे में, ये हमें पता नहीं था. एंड देन आई रेड मानो माजरा बाय खुशवंत सिंह और देखा कि he has described the slow relay of bats, और मुझे लगा I have found a language. You know what I'm saying? Now your question is कि was there also an idea of how that by writing one was finding oneself? I think I only dimly perceived it at that point. And I think it was only after a few more years, the idea that writing, and by writing, I was shaping myself as a perceptive or quote unquote sensitive or socially aware, or at least an observer. ये थोड़ी देर से आई, but that was the critical thing. One thing I want to add is, आप अभी मुंबई से हमसे बात कर रहे हैं. And I always associate among so many other wonderful people that city with my friend and your friend maybe Suketu Mehta. मैं उसके बारे में हमेशा ये सोचता हूँ that when I'm walking with him, why is it that I find things happen or stories happen? And I think that's because he's looking for stories. Let's say two people go to a platform. One person goes to the railway platform to catch a train. The other person goes to the platform to write a story, to observe. And then suddenly, they hear a clamor at the end of the platform. जो बंदा ट्रेन पकड़ने आया है, he will stay with his luggage because he has to catch the train. The person who has come looking for a story will rush towards the clamor. ठीक है ना? And he will probably find that, a child has been left behind. The parent went into the train, thought the child had followed, and now there is a child. The child has to be reunited with the parent. A story has started. ठीक है, तो सुकेतु जी वहीं रह जाएंगे बच्चे के साथ, और till the child and the parent is found, he will have a story to pursue. ठीक है ना? So that is the difference. The idea that now I do inhabit the space when I think that I am both looking for a language, but I'm also looking for the narrative of my life. Where am I? Who is around me? What is happening to us? Where is the world going? So, yes, to what you were earlier asking me, my answer is yes, but it was a long journey to that realization. And it always takes time, but here we are.
So I'll dial back to the first part of your answer, and in fact, leaving the self out of it, just talk about observation and how one sort of learns to see. Like, I'll quote from a couple of places from your books that I really enjoyed. From A Matter of Rats, I was struck by this passage where you write, quote, "In the middle of the night one winter, during a visit to Patna, I was sitting at the dining table with my jet-lagged 2-year-old son, watching a cartoon on my computer. I had turned on only a single dim light as I didn't want my parents to be disturbed. We must have been sitting there quietly for about half an hour before my little boy asked, 'Baba, what is that?' He was pointing beyond the screen. There were two enormous rats walking away from us. They looked like stout ladies on tiny heels on their way to their market. I wouldn't have been surprised to see them carrying small, elegant handbags." Stop quote. And this is such a delightful moment. Later on, there's a similar moment where somebody asks you to write a few sentences about Patna in an issue that magazine is doing for vacations. And you say, quote, "I wrote that going to Patna for a vacation was rather like going to a bus stop for a martini." which is again just absolutely brilliant, says so much. Later on in Husband of a Fanatic, there is this brilliant description. I won't read out the full thing, but you talk about what sort of the burnt houses you would see in parts of Ahmedabad, like Naroda Patia and so on. And you describe it in detail, but I am struck by a couple of images. One where you talk about how the blades of a ceiling fan had dropped in the fire and resembled the wilted petals of a flower. In another, a sack of sugar had turned to dark amber syrup and flowed onto the steps where it had dried, which again I thought was just such a powerful image. And in the Blue Book, at one point, you write about this photograph that appeared on your Facebook timeline about a railway, an accident on a railway line, 16 workers who were sleeping on the railway track because they were, walking on the tracks to go home because they didn't want to be harassed by the cops on the streets. They were run over by a train.
Right.
And you've written, quote, the first item I noticed in the image was a red Hawaii chappal. I think abandoned footwear tell their own forlorn story. A solitary chappal or shoe narrates a tale of hasty exit, not from a glitzy ball like Fair Cinderella, but from life itself. And later on, you talk about the rotis scattered on the cinders on the ground, a lemon, one blue mask, a pair of black trousers, no torso attached to it, and so on and so forth. And these are really powerful images. Like, I remember that, when in the aftermath of the tsunami, I was traveling through the coast of Tamil Nadu and blogging about my experiences. And my most powerful memory of that time, and of course, one saw dead bodies in Nagapattinam and walked with charred bodies all around, which had been there for 3-4 days, and all those things are there. But my most striking memory is still a set of disparate memories of clocks and watches in different villages across the coastline, all of which had stopped at a different time. And by looking at the time when they had stopped, you could make out when the wave sort of hit, going back to your earlier theme of sort of capturing time, a very poignant way of that. Now, my question to you is also partly a lament. I think I don't observe things well enough. When I set out to write about something, then I am seeing, but otherwise I am not often enough in the moment. In some ways, I am a third guy at that railway platform. One guy is looking for a story, one guy is waiting for a train, one guy is lost in his own head.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes,
Kuch nahi
yes.
chal raha hai. So I'm that third guy. You are clearly a bit more like that second guy. Right?
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about, like you mentioned earlier that you were jealous of your, when you were a child, of how that other person who had seen that thing on the roof had written about it. So obviously your own power of observation came from conscious effort. Is part of it a conscious effort because I have to write and therefore you see, and does part of it become then a reflexive habit where every day, whether you are writing or not, you are noticing things in a different way?
I do think that if you are writing things, you actually almost create feeling or affect. In other words, you do something because you know you're going to write. But let me explain that a little bit more, like how it happened in my own evolution as a writer, in case there are young people listening. क्या हुआ कि मैं दिल्ली आया, and there was an essay by George Orwell that we read, in which he explains that there was a voice running in his head always, like providing a narrative. जैसे कि एक, almost you could think of कि भाई film चल रही है और नीचे subtitles आ रहे हैं, which would be, right now for example, would be the sun streaming in, a very unusual London sun, a very bright, very harsh, was streaming in through, the sunlight was streaming through the window and hitting the right side of my face, even as I was talking to Amit. I thought I should move the plant that had toppled over yesterday from my windowsill into the sunlight so that it receives some light, blah, blah, blah. ठीक है ना? So this idea, when I read this description in Orwell, I thought, अरे ये तो शायद मेरे साथ भी होता है कि मैं DTC बस में हूँ और वो चांदनी चौक से गुजर रहे हैं, and I'm looking at that woman who is standing beside the vendor, and this is how she's looking, and मुझे suddenly याद आई वो फिल्म जो मैंने देखी थी जिसमें वहीदा रहमान was doing this or that. ठीक है ना? Okay. So that conscious cultivation that you were talking about became this cultivation of a voice in my head describing the slope of a roof or the smoke rising from a chimney or an egret taking flight or the dark descending after sunset. ठीक है ना? तो वो हुआ. And I think That's how I consciously wave. That I would say is the practice. I also think that in teaching writing, I set up challenges for my students, and doing some of that myself uh, also encouraged me to see. One thing I remember very, very clearly is, I don't know how it happened, but I would have been, I don't know, 17, 18, Delhi mein. I quite clearly remember that I would enter a room and try to think, if I closed my eyes, how many things have I seen here that I will remember? ठीक है ना? There was a Sai Baba ka temple, and a politician turned writer, or writer turned politician, invited me to come and meet him there. And I very clearly have this memory. I must have been 18 or so. I very clearly have this memory that I shut my eyes for a second to think, how many things do I remember here in this hotel room? क्योंकि वो लगा ना जैसे अनजान सा कमरा है किसी और का. It was an alien room for him. It was an alien room for me. And I thought, this is new. And what do I remember? Okay, so I remember the chair on Prash. I remember the table mat. I remember, उस तरह की चीजें. And a small towel which has been folded in a particular way. And that just became fixed. Lately, which is a much more recent thing, अब मैं drawing start कर दिया हूँ. So that is what you see in Blue Book. And that has been another way which really people like John Berger, etc. explain कि भाई, you do not see the world unless you draw it. So that is also a part now of my regimen. मैं रोज आजकल, I'm doing one drawing also every day. Apart from writing every day, I'm trying to do one drawing every day. So not trying, I am doing it actually. Which is it's a way of training oneself to observe and to see.
That's one of the things that kind of struck me about your very interesting book. Like the first time I noticed something like this being done, images used with birds, was W.G. Sebald and Austerlitz and so on, those stark black and white images. And your stuff was also very powerful in the sense there is one particular drawing where I loved the caption, where I think you made it from a photograph where a guy was kneeling on the street and covered in blood, and your caption was something to the effect of "man with red marks on him." Which was so ironic and kind of went so well with the image. How has sort of getting into that practice of drawing all the time changed the way that you see? Like, does it change the way that you then come back to words and use those words? Has it made you kind of more economical? In what ways has that affected your imagination?
The same way as I said earlier, that there was this voice running through my head that was telling me what I was noticing, and I would try to translate what I was seeing into words. Now, this recent practice of drawing, what it has made me do is that I'm drawing with my eye all the time. जैसे कि लंदन के शहरों ये स्ट्रीट्स पे मैं चल रहा हूँ, and these buildings and their chimneys are just so distinctive about this city that my eye is always doing that. So that is an immediate thing I have seen. Has it changed my relationship to words? It's very interesting that you mentioned Sebald, because what he's doing is he would take an image. मान लो he's writing about some period close to the Holocaust. He would take an image. Let's say that image is a postcard. He would take the postcard, मगर instead of simply printing the postcard, वो उसको पहले xerox करता था, और उसके he would introduce a corruption in the image, almost, if I could use the word, because he wanted to complicate the relationship between word and image. He did not want to say, look, this is the illustration. He wanted you to actually engage in the mystery of science, SIGNS, ताकि आप, it's a much more subtle engagement that then the reader has with what he or she is reading and what he or she is seeing. So, what am I doing? Am I introducing ambivalence about the image? In the case of the example you said of a man being lynched, मैंने जो तस्वीर बनाई है, I wanted to just, as I say there, I wanted to slow jam the news. In other words, where some things happen and the news is quickly spread and consumed, I just wanted to slow it down. और जब मैं ड्राइंग उस आदमी का कर रहा हूं तो माई सेंस ऑफ हिम एज ही इज प्लीडिंग फॉर हिज लाइफ also gets slowed down. I'm absorbing it even emotionally in a slower way, in a more thoughtful way, maybe also. And if I do that, and if I'm surrounding it with a caption, and a caption that you rightly said was, interesting because it's a little bit more oblique, I'm again slowing down the arrow of time so that our absorption in the moment and in the trauma itself is more is slowed down actually, really. Yeah, ताकि हम लोग जल्दी से उसको absorb करके और जल्दी से हम लोग we don't go past it but we linger with it a bit. So that's what I'm doing, and I guess therefore the answer to your question would be कि the relationship is changing in the sense that it becomes a little bit more, instead of being facile, it becomes more meditative, ताकि मैं वो एक एडवर्टाइजिंग जिंगल की तरह नहीं रहे, quickly swallowed, quickly passed on, but like a longer song.
The caption that you gave was actually a man with red marks on his body. And I was very struck by that because it seemed to reflect a theme that you have gone into in earlier books also, including in Husband of a Fanatic, when you're traveling through all these places where so much violence has happened. This is page 92, by the way. And it seemed to indicate the banality of what's happening, that the man is covered in blood and he's begging for his life, and you describe him as a man with red marks on his body, where something so significant is described in such a banal way. And in a sense, in all of these places, what we see, what you've wrote about so eloquently in Husband of a Fanatic as well, when you travel through Gujarat after the riots and everything that goes down there, is that normal life resumes, that there will be this explosive event which will upend lives forever, and the world will never be the same again. And yet normality at some level will resume, like that old cliche we use these days of the new normal and all of that. This caption seemed to have the same kind of effect. But we'll get back to that. I wanted to sort of double click again on one aspect of your earlier answer and my earlier question about observation and drawing and all of that. I thought back to your description of those rats, stout ladies on tiny heels, and you could imagine them with small, elegant handbags. Now, the thing is, if you were drawing this, you may not draw them like that. You might draw them differently. So what's happening, in a sense, is that what you're drawing and what you're writing is different because your skill sets are kind of different. Your interests may be different. Your aesthetic style may be different. And therefore, a larger question that came up and that has come up in earlier episodes I've done with creators is how much is your style an expression not just of what you can do, but also of what you can't do? An expression of your limitations, as it were. Like, you can't draw the rats as fat little aunties, right? But you can draw them in a very interesting way, which is your own and which is your own voice. So here, obviously, I'm thinking in the context of drawing, because I would not be able to draw anything at all. And and you've had decades more experience of writing, so much more fluid there. So what are sort of your thoughts on this? Because these are two different forms that you're expressing yourself in, and at different times you have thought about, how do I find the language for this, and what shapes that language? So
yeah, interesting thoughts, very interesting questions. Yeah, पहले तो ये कहना है कि the reason why you were drawn to, if drawn is the word I want, the reason you were attracted by or you found amusing that line about the rats was because it brought together in a surprising relationship two things, and yet it held some truth. Yeah, it seemed to, and I think that. So one aspect I want to say there is that it is a way of seeing which really is about metaphor. It is about seeing one thing in terms of another. And that ability is something that I have seen. जैसे कि no one in my village back in Bihar might necessarily be a writer or might even actually be literate. ठीक है? My grandmother was not literate, but her language was more writerly than many of the writers you will find at Jaipur Literature Festival. Because her language was वो जो हिंदी में कहते हैं अलंकृत भाषा, यानी कि there was an element of adornment in precisely because everything was expressed in terms of metaphor. भाई मैं उनसे कहा था अगर कि भाई आप मजाक में I would say कि I will marry a white woman and I will come back, I will introduce you. She would say ना हमारा from in Bhojpuri, which was our language, she would say that कि my nose is as flat as a bedbug's back. ठीक है? उसको तो
How would she say it in Bhojpuri?
तो my grandmother would say हमार नकवा त खटमल के पीठ ऐसन बा. तो मैंने I remember I was again our conversation is taking me back to my earlier memories, but because I was struggling with words and language, again as a teenager, studying in Patna, going back to my village, एक हैंड पंप पे बर्तन धो रहा था एक आदमी जो हमारे घर में काम करता था. I saw that he was moving very slowly, so I asked him how he was, and he said, "अरे का बताएं, हमार त कपार तवा ऐसन तपकता." Meaning that what can I tell you? My forehead is burning like tawa ka क्या कहें, like the
Stove.
pan, like
the pan on the stove.
Pan on which the roti is baked or toasted or cooked. And I thought कि देखो, I thought how quickly and how vividly, using an idiom that is drawn from something close enough, he has however brought this alive. So the economy वाली बात जो तुमने कही ना पहले, it is an economical evocation of a situation through a quick metaphor. And I think I feel I'm failing as a writer when I do not find a metaphor on every page in my writing. Just like, something that makes a quick and surprising. The other thing about what you can't do that interested me immediately when you were talking about it and it struck me was कि भाई, when I was during this period that I'm describing to you, when I was searching for a language adequate to describe my surroundings, it coincided with another discovery, which was my total inadequacy as an artist. Because my parents would take me on the steamer from Patna. We would cross the river Ganga and to go to our village. Leaving my small home and getting on the boat would always make me feel कि भैया मैं तो बड़ी खूबसूरत जगह में हूँ, यहाँ फैलाव है, there is such beauty. Even just the flat expanse of a brown muddy river with a single boat and a red pennant would suggest to me कि भैया इसको तो paint करना चाहिए. And every time I attempted it, I failed. लगता था कि there was no correspondence. So my failure as an artist, what you can't do, I think further propelled me into the art of writing. Okay? But now, drawing interests me because having accomplished, मैं अपने को बहुत बड़ा writer नहीं मान रहा हूँ, but because writing has become easy to a great extent, the taking up drawing is an entry into what I can't do, is an entry into the art of the amateur. And therefore it is discovery कि भैया, it doesn't matter if I fail. It doesn't matter if I'm a, chutia type artist. What matters really is that I'm doing it every day and I'm trying to do it as honestly as I can and as creatively, not to be complacent about it, but instead to challenge oneself कि भाई अच्छा ये watercolor में किया तो अब थोड़ा सा gouache में करते हैं. And भगवान साथ दिया तो अगले समर में I'm thinking कि oil में भी जाऊंगा, just to try it out, how it feels. So this is really about how creativity is also about the art of the amateur, someone who is trying something. And I think writing ho, drawing ho, dance ho, who knows, even chess or poker ho, at which you excel, हमारे लिए those are amateur arts, A 7-year-old can beat me, but who cares? Chess का मजा ले रहा है.
Beautifully said. And I'm reminded of this quote in your book where, in the Blue Book, in your third section, writing a novel, you quote William Maxwell as saying, quote, after 40 years, what I came to care about most was not style, but the breath of life.
क्या
Stop
बात
quote.
है.
And that just seems to express what you just said, that at least in your art, like in your writing, certainly you would be thinking deeply about craft and noticing imperfections, but at least in your art, it's that breath of life. It's a man with red marks. Doesn't have to be perfect like Picasso would have done it or whatever.
See. I mean, by the way, I'm so glad that the William Maxwell quote interested you and attracted you. I would place it among my, top 10. I think everyone should have, let's say, 10 books on their shelf, which they can return to. And they should also have a list of at least 10 quotes, which they can always adhere to. And that is one of them. Not style, but the breath of life. To ask oneself कि हर समय कि भैया इसमें breath of life है कि नहीं, just to catch something, And often I remember, Doordarshan came when I was a young man. I mean, the television came into my life after the Asian Games, and we were watching a movie, and then Mrinal Sen was being interviewed. And Mrinal Sen, either quoting himself, or producing an original quote or quoting someone else, said, well, and I think he was, in my mind at that time, I saw him as different from, let's say, Satyajit Ray, who was a perfectionist. Mrinal Sen said, I like imperfections. Imperfections are the cracks through which poetry comes in. और मुझे लगा अरे जल्दी से जाके इसको लिख लेता हूँ, because then think कि भैया जो imperfections है ना, which everything that will look improvised, but will nevertheless have something of an immediacy. Everything that will have a little bit of an imperfection will nevertheless be what will make it come more alive. मुझे बड़ा valuable lesson लगा, so I've held that close to me too.
Beautiful. Earlier you spoke about how you'd go back to the village and how the language was so musical, and that reminded me of this anecdote in a Matter of Rats also, where you write about Ravish Kumar, and how when Ravish Kumar was in college, he was jealous of a friend who could write a 20-page essay in English, और उस बेचारे से नहीं होती थी. So once for an exam, apparently he wrote, just in Hindi he wrote, and the examiner came to his hostel and he asked for Ravish, and he told everybody, quote, इसकी भाषा से संगीत निकलती है.
क्या बात
Stop quote. And I absolutely love that. And I was also sort of struck by something that you said in your book, where at one point a magazine called Samkaleen Janmath, which was being published from Patna, gave you a regular column called Letter from America, and you would write in English and they would publish it in Hindi, and you were so moved that sometimes you would cry. And you've also given an example on the very next page of the Blue Book. These are pages 57 and 58. I love this book so much. I've noted down page numbers of all my
Thank you,
notes. By
boss.
the way, you quote a short poem by your friend Alok Dhanwa, a Patna poet, and I'll read this out. And the poem goes, रेल हर भले आदमी की एक रेल होती है जो माँ के घर की ओर जाती है, सीटी बजाती हुई, धुआं उड़ाती हुई. Right, and you've attempted, an English translation of this, but the fact is, the music of this, the simplicity, the lilt in it,
सही.
सीटी बजाती हुई, धुआं उड़ाती हुई, cannot be captured, cannot be translated.
सही बात है, बिल्कुल सही बात है.
And in fact, I read this late last night and I was so excited. I sent this by WhatsApp to my writing students and I said, ki dekho, this is why translation is impossible.
Yes.
And I've discussed translation a lot with them in terms of ki har language ki ek character hoti hai which cannot possibly translate through. And this also has an effect on us who may not necessarily translate from one language to the other, but we are bilingual. A part of our lives is lived in one language naturally, जैसे हम दोनों के बीच में हिंदी हो रही है, right?
Right.
As it kind of comes naturally. And yet we are sort of writing in English where the sensibilities may be different. Like all languages have such particular characters. Japanese and Korean can be so spare. Urdu and Punjabi can be so expressionistic and maximalistic, and You can't just translate one on one. You will miss these little kind of nuances. Now in your own life, in a sense, you are always like, of course there is, one view that any writing is an act of translation. You have thoughts in your head and you're translating them into the language in which they're coming out. But also a lot of your experiences are experienced in Hindi or experienced in Bhojpuri, and then you write about it and you're trying to capture the flavor and all of that. What is a role that languages have played in your life? Like, how much of what you are as a writer in English is shaped by what you have lived in Hindi and Bhojpuri? How much of a challenge is it?
Yeah, those are all such wonderful reflections. What a beautiful poem, boss. What a beautiful poem. रेल, हर भले आदमी की एक रेल होती है जो मां के घर की ओर जाती है, सीटी बजाती हुई, धुआं उड़ाती हुई. Amazing.
Beautiful, no?
I think of it and I think of my mother, I think of my mother waiting for me when the train from Delhi during all those college days would bring me. And sometimes, because people always pulled the chain and stopped the train earlier, sometimes I got out earlier and arrived home by just crossing one fence. I had to just climb over the fence and I could drop into my garden, because my home was very close to the railway line. And to surprise my mother, it filled me with tears when I read this poem, because I remembered my mother, who has now died, waiting for me and being delighted, by my early arrival and saying, "Arey, tu humko fir se surprise kar diya," Amazing. To answer your question, I experienced the loss of Hindi when my grandmother died, because I would, at least after coming to the West, कम से कम उनको तो कहा चिट्ठी में हिंदी में लिखता था, so that someone in the village could read it out to her. She would stop one cousin of mine or anyone else who was literate. She would say, "Bhai, चिट्ठी पढ़ दो." So the letters that I wrote were in some ways almost public letters, because so many people heard it. And I felt after her death कि हिंदी से वो नाता छूट गया. Now the point you have mentioned from Samkaleen Janmat, boss, I'm not lying. I don't think, as I have said before, I don't have any immodest expectations or ideas about my writing. लेकिन जब ये लोग translate करके भेजते थे, मेरे तो the hairs at the back of my neck would stand sometimes because of the emotion they aroused. Because just that making it into Hindi, what I was saying made it so much more closer to my heart. It became as if it was somehow, language became at once more intimate and also eloquent, actually. So that's why. And yet the tragedy is, Manoj Vajpayee once said to me कि भाई उसको तो, when he was at Ramjas, his roommates and others in the hostel would make him read out the Times of India, because then they could laugh at him because of the way he pronounced the words. ठीक है ना? So I, coming from a similar background, Manoj's village is just 40 minutes from mine. Coming from a similar background, and so too with Ravish, he's also from Champaran, like me. The idea of English being this other thing that we had to master was always a challenge. It was something I certainly set out to do. I wanted to find a place for myself in that landscape called English literature. ठीक है ना? And I think in various ways, all these three figures we have talked about, or these two other figures we have talked about, have responded with great elan. In case of Manoj Vajpayee, he said कि सारे अंग्रेजी मुझसे बुलवाओगे, मैं भाई बताता हूँ कि हिंदी कैसे बोलना चाहिए. And the enormous energy he brings on the screen is that of someone who is coming up through the trapdoor of history on the stage, and he's occupying the stage with great bravura. And with Ravish, I mean, the way in which his presentation of news achieves a quality of lyrical eloquence is a marvelous achievement. It makes him stand out from all those people who are not only the purveyor of cheap or subservient news, it marks him out as distinctive from all those people who do not have a grip on language and how it should reach the public ear. ठीक है ना? In my case, I have to say that early on, when I was studying in Delhi, all the debates would be about English, Indian English, And I was, for a while, interested in things like, let's say Raja Rao की writing में भाई किस तरह से work कर रहा है, तो Nissim Ezekiel में एक homeliness किस तरह से आती है, तो what is Arun Kolatkar doing in Jejuri. But later on, thinking of, it didn't seem so much of a preoccupation, except I loved it when my first novel Home Products came out, and Rajkamal Jha wrote to me and said, "Ki boss, ये तो किताब है, when one reading it in English, one thinks one is reading it in Hindi."
Wow.
तो मुझे लगा कि हाँ बॉस, आपने दिल को छू दिया मेरा, But that's what I also felt. There aren't many books. It is wonderful that so many more Indian writers are so at ease with English that their books come out without any degree of self-consciousness. They are all in English, they write, but they are also in many ways very urban and urbane. I am, despite my stay abroad, I'm not urban and urbane in that way at all. I feel कि वो एक देहातीपन मेरे घर और एक छोटा सा गांव कहीं मेरे अंदर बसता है, and therefore I speak from that place, and therefore Rajkamal's praise or observation really touched me, and I think that there is an idea of a provincialism or provincialism कभी कभी negative term होती है, तो there's an idea of a provincial articulation in one's language जो मैं अभी भी practice करता हूँ. So I cannot make it too क्या कहूँ, I cannot make it very beautiful or very adorned or very chic or very fashionable. मेरी भाषा में हमेशा कभी क्या कहें, दाल और, जैसे दिलीप कुमार ने एक बार कभी शायद कहा था लता मंगेशकर के गाने के बारे में, इसमें से दाल और चावल की बू आती रहेगी. You know what I'm saying? एक something, a small town will always be there, and that is true of the language also.
That's a beauty in your writing. It's a feature, not a bug, frankly. I mean, I've noted down so many quotes in my notes from your writing because I was so struck by them. And what you said about Ravish is also interesting. Like, there is a place in one of your books, I think A Matter of Rats, where you write about nonfiction. And in that, you come up with a credo for nonfiction writers where you say, quote, "To show on the page that despite what you're saying, there is another story waiting in the wings." Stop quote. And I think when Ravish delivers news, that's exactly what he is doing. The news he delivers are the same events that everyone else will deliver, but nobody, delivers the same news, which is brilliant. Now, I'm also sort of struck by this notion of English as a language which must be learned, which must be mastered. Now, in my case, because of the kind of privileged upbringing I had and all of that, English was always sort of natural to me. It felt like my language. With other languages, I might have struggled. And during my writing classes, one of the participants wrote to me and she said that, look, here's the thing. The problem is that my first language is Hindi. I'm trying to learn English. I'm passionate about it, but it is hard work. And we started having a discussion on that. I had heard this beautiful interview of Jhumpa Lahiri when she appeared on the show Conversations with Tyler. Jhumka, of course, learned Italian from scratch and then wrote a book in it, right? And in that interview, she pointed to a writer called Agota Christoph, whom you must have read. And Agota Christoph was, I think, a Hungarian writer or something. And because of the war or events in Europe, she shifted to France when she was 21, 22. And she started learning French when she was 21, 22, basically, and wrote a brilliant series of novels in it, especially one called the Notebook Trilogy, 3 novels together. And I was just blown away by the starkness and power of the writing. You also begin to see how she stripped it down to its elemental bits and made it all her own. And when I pointed out this to the student who had asked me this, she actually got the Notebook Trilogy from Agata Christoph and she started copying it paragraphs, in her own handwriting, just to get a sense of the rhythm and the lay and all of that.
That's a very good technique.
And I thought what often happens, and when I give writing prompts to my students also, I'll put in all kinds of restrictions like don't use multisyllable words, don't use adjectives and adverbs. So the whole point not being to impose a sense of values, but the whole point being to build that mindfulness where you look at language so closely. And in your case, I would imagine that because it is a language that you're setting out to master, as you said, that you are looking at it more closely, not taking it for granted like someone like me would, where I just read it and, I read it for the story or I read it for whatever, but you're looking at it kind of deeper. So over the years, can you tell me about this process. That when did you start looking at writing in that mindful way, where you're noticing craft, you're noticing all the tricks of the trade, so to say, how rhythm is built, how all this is done, and how your own writing kind of evolved. Who were the early writers whose craft you looked at? Who were the people you identified with? Who were the people you liked and said, hey, that's great, but I can't do that? Kaisa tha?
Yes. One thing that happened when I would go back to my village in Champaran, I'm talking when I was 7 or 8 or 9, for example. One of the things that happened within hours and certainly in days would be that I would be called in front of an assembly of male elders, and someone would give me a line in Hindi and say, "How will you say it in English?"
Wow.
ट्रेन के आने के पहले ही मैं स्टेशन से चला गया था. This was a more complicated formulation. Yeah? Let's say mere Phupa, who was an advocate in Motihari, would offer this line, and then I would perform by translating, and then people, none of the audience knew English, but just to hear these words out was the first lesson into how you were supposed to be a master. You were supposed to be a master if you could translate a sentence of English. ठीक है ना? Now that exercise, of course, didn't interest me too long. It was really the physical description. I can't tell you how exciting it was. मेरे teachers बड़े unimaginative और dull थे. मैं जब college में गया दिल्ली में पढ़ने, so I would often go instead to libraries like Sahitya Academy Library वगैरह. On those days on which I was not trying to actually have a Will's navy cut and some tea with one of the girls who would sometimes talk to me, yeah, वो campus पे. तो जिन दिनों वो नहीं होता था, वैसा कोई प्लान नहीं था, तो I would get down, and it was a great discovery. जैसे वेद मेहता या Kushwant Singh, whom I mentioned before, Dom Moraes or Arun Kolatkar, because they were describing our own streets. जैसे कि दिल्ली की शहर एक डिस्क्रिप्शन था, तो मुझे एक तरह से भाषा, I would think कि हाँ, just the idea कि मैं भी बैठा हूँ, let's say if I'm sitting in Sahitya Academy Library in Delhi, and there was a description of, I don't know, Aurangzeb Road, which I'm told has now been changed into something else. There would be a frizzo. जैसे कि Connaught Place के दुकानों के pillars की ही description से मुझे लगता था कि अरे, I'm getting a sense of how to map my place in this world. ठीक है? So those were really wonderful. मैं एक शाम को याद है मुझे, I again must be 17, 18, I can't remember, 20. I was listening to a koel, गर्मी का दिन था. I thought, if I write a few lines, कैसा, I mean, can I evoke this feeling? And I wrote it and immediately mailed it to Kushwant Singh. And a few days later, a letter from him arrived, said, very, very nice, very evocative. This was the word he used. Continue writing or something like that. You're very young. Someone like that says that, you think, okay, ठीक है, मैं कुछ कर रहा हूँ सही. So those were the great influences. Now, at that time. And then I was not able to get a place in the hostel in Delhi. But such is the generosity of young people. Up to, at old age, you become more cantankerous. I was allowed to sleep on the bed, on the floor with my own hold-all bedding come hold-all एक होता है, उसको in another friend's room, और उसके पास नाइपॉल की एक छोटी किताब, एक autobiography थी, it's called like a fragment of an autobiography, and that was a wonderful discovery for me. उसके बाद मैं नाइपॉल को पढ़ने लगा, and he was a great influence. Again, because he was giving a language to something that was familiar. And if you read something like A Million Mutinies now, the idea of observing cities and people and places in India is a great manual for acquiring a vocabulary of looking and describing. बाद में, people like J.M. Coetzee or more journalists, for journalistic sort of a thing, Joan Didion, or for a slightly more psychoanalytic take on the self, and an ability to criticize the profession of journalism itself. Janet Malcolm. You had to become a bit more theoretical and sophisticated. Susan Sontag. ये सारे नाम मेरे लिए बड़े influential थे. Later, with age and after publishing, writers became also, my friends, and so then it became a different kind of circle. So, people like Arundhati Roy or Kiran Desai, Pankaj Mishra, Amit Chaudhary, these are people who have had great influence, I think, because I feel as if I'm in conversation with them. So that, am I answering your question? कि जैसे कि किस तरह से
Yeah, of
evolution
course.
हुई? Yeah. और बोलो तो मैं बताऊंगा कुछ और उस पे.
I want to double click on a couple of things here, but before that एक aside लेते हैं. आपने पोस्ट कार्ड का मेंशन किया, पहले भी आपने मेंशन किया कि आप खतें भेजते थे. And I remember this recent conversation I had with a mutual friend of ours, Chandrahas Chaudhary. And Chandrahas, as you would know, has a habit of writing these delightfully charming emails, जैसे पहले दिनों में खत लिखते थे.
No. He doesn't write anything like that to me. He does that only for you.
Okay. ठीक है. Oh my God, I think I got him into trouble. But yeah, so he sent me this delightful long email, with memories and with this and that. And I was like, okay, I remember writing and receiving such letters in the 80s and 90s. अभी ऐसा कुछ नहीं होता है. अभी email में होता है, पूरा matter of fact होता है. It's all transactional that, oh, what date are you in Delhi? When are you in Bombay? Are you okay? I hope you're better now. ये सब चलता है. But this whole thing of reminiscing that you remember we were in Pune and we had samosas at that place and they are the best samosas I've ever had and all of that. So uska ek sort of charm hai of that kind of communication. And we kind of got talking about this because I pointed this out to him that this is something that I actually miss, and I didn't know I missed it till he sent me that beautiful letter. In your book also there are traces of this in the Blue Book. For example, Cheryl Strayed, you reproduce a postcard that she has sent, and you are sort of communicating by postcard as well in a couple of places. Which is interesting because when you sit down to write like that, and especially a pen or paper leke, you sit down and you're writing a letter out by hand, it seems that there is a tehraaf to that. There is a consideration to what you are writing. And again, like we spoke about writing and the self, you are thinking in that moment, you are reflecting, there is reflection happening. And that is shaping you because you are writing like that. And that is something that goes missing when everything is WhatsApp messages and emails, and everybody is immediately within reach, so everything becomes functional. And therefore you become a different person because that self-reflection, that shaping isn't happening. I wrote an essay once about the form that one uses shapes the content that one produces, and that changes the person that you are. Like just these long conversations, because I have 4-5 hour conversations, I am forced to listen. I'm forced to listen. I'm forced to digress. Me and my guest will happily go into all kinds of little rabbit holes on the side like you and I are. And I think that changes the form, changes the content. Like a half an hour interview would be very snap, staccato, सवाल पूछिए, ये book का idea आपके पास कैसे आया, that kind of bullshit. It's shallow. It's very different. Something like this, the form shapes the content and shapes me. Because I think in the course of doing this show, I've become a better listener, more empathetic, more whatever. So you've sort of lived through so many changes in form. जब आप pen और paper कर रहे हो, उसके बाद आप laptop पे कर रहे हो, even the way that you drew then, and you said you used to fail when you were drawing historical figures in class, which is why you were drawn to writing, and later the way that you draw and you paint now, the way that we live our lives. What are your thoughts on these?
First of all, I'm so glad you mentioned why your show is so long. हाँ? क्योंकि किसी ने, मेरे एक दोस्त ने मजाक किया कि भाई ये तो शोले से भी और लंबा है. It's longer than शोले. I'm glad that you mentioned it because every work of art, I believe, and I tell my students this, should also tell the viewer or the reader how it should be consumed. In other words, should explain its own logic at some way, in a subtle way, but it should. And what you have done, very cleverly, I think, is explain कि भैया, why the hell are we talking for 3 hours, या 4 hours? जो भी है, ये जुगलबंदी जैसे कि इतनी देर तक क्यों चल रही है? Because people are going to improvise and they're going to draw upon their training and their discipline to extract something in a rigorous way for a while and see where fate or time or art leads them. That's what we are doing. So Good job talking about the form. When you were talking about the letters and the letters being now dropping out as a practice, my first thought actually was all those books that I have read, which are letters written by people and which I've enjoyed so much, is now going to be lost. You know, रॉबर्ट लॉवेल और एलिजाबेथ बिशप, तो नेहरू जी अपनी बेटी को लिख रहे हैं चिट्ठियां, गांधी लिख रहे हैं these little notes, but they bring back history, they show the dynamics. The other day someone posted on Facebook, I saw a letter written by Subhash Bose to Jawaharlal Nehru. Oh my God, yeah, बड़े ही जीवंत कहानियां वहां पे हैं. And that we have lost. I don't know about you. Are you going to? I'm thinking that I'm actually going to use emails. I try sometimes to use screen grabs. उसी दिन, because we are talking about Blue Book, मुझे एक नोट आया from a writer I admire a lot, Z.D. Smith. तो मैंने अपने एडिटर को कहा कि भाई इसको तो मैं अगले वाले बुक में, उसको मान लीजिए येलो बुक कहते हैं, उसमें जरूर डालूंगा. ठीक है, तो यह आपको भी मैं सुनाता हूँ. दिस इज आवर फर्स्ट प्रेजेंटेशन. चलो, उसने लिखा कि भाई आई लव योर ब्लू बुक. आई मेंट टू रीड अ पेज ऑफ इट लेट लास्ट नाइट एंड इंस्टेड आई रेड द होल थिंग एंड देन सफर्ड ऑन द स्कूल रन दिस मॉर्निंग. अ लवली थिंग. ठीक है, तो मैंने उसको जवाब में लिखा कि ऐसा है कि मेरा दूसरा एक देयर इज अ म्यूचुअल फ्रेंड ऑफ आवर्स कॉल्ड तेजू कोल. तो उससे मजाक मेरी हमेशा होती है कि भाई, क्योंकि मैं उससे बड़ा हूँ, जिस तरह से आई एम ओल्डर देन यू, मैं उससे हमेशा कहता हूँ कि भाई अगर कोई भी अच्छी बात कहता है, या if I write a vicious letter about a dean, or if I write something about a writer that both of us find obnoxious, he will say, or I will say, कि भाई मेरे funeral में, मेरे memorial में, वो उसको he will read it aloud. ठीक है, तो we have a whole list of those things जो वो पढ़ेगा. तो मैंने उस दिन जेडी को लिखा कि भाई Teju and I have this constant back and forth about what he's going to read out at my memorial. We joke about all kinds of things, including my angry letters. But I think I'll leave instructions in my will about this message from you. ठीक है, और फिर मैंने कहा, I think he might want you to tape it on your phone and send it before the music starts in the Vassar chapel. और उसको मैंने hyperlink कर दिया because the music I wanted her to know was going to be this from this Hungarian composer Henrik Gorecki. और फिर मैंने उसको ब्रैकेट में लिखा, you can see that we have given some thought to this. तो जेडी ने उधर से जवाब दिया कि भाई my phone cannot record anything. I'll just have to come in person. ठीक है, तब ये एक्सचेंज तो मुझे बड़ा डिलाइटफुल सा लगा, इसलिए मैंने सोचा है कि मैं तो इसको अगले वाली किताब में डाल दूंगा. In the same way as in the Blue Book, this whole exchange I have with Ian Jack about should I do art? Should I not do art? Why is writing the more difficult enterprise? And then what sentences to keep and what sentences to remove? मुझे बड़ा revealing सा लगा, so I put that in. So I am certainly, in the spirit of what you have been saying, I do want to actually preserve, even though you're right about the form, often it makes writing so much more truncated and brutally swift. I want to preserve some of these exchanges and make it a document of sorts.
Beautiful. I'm going to double click on the Ian Jack conversation that you had with him in your book, which I loved. But before that, I did this recent episode on the debates of Jawaharlal Nehru with Ripurdaman Singh and Adil Hussain. Have written this excellent book about Nehru's 4 debates with Muhammad Iqbal, Jinnah, Sardar Patel and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. And it is incredible. These people are writing letters to each other or sometimes replying to each other through columns and all that. And the erudition is mind-blowing. Like Nehru jail mein baith ke chitti likh raha hai, where he's, from memory, he's coming up with all these quotes and drawing all these connections, and it is so lucid and clear. Jinnah is not at his best in this particular exchange, but if you read other things by him, it's much better. And one thinks that these people are constantly in dialogue with each other, and therefore they are deepening their own thinking, and that makes a difference. One might agree or disagree. I agree with a lot of what Nehru did. I disagree strongly with a lot of it. But there's an engagement with ideas, with opposing ideas, which somehow I feel in modern times is kind of missing. But the part about your conversation with Ian Jack that I wanted to double click on and ask about is at one point when he replies to something you have written, he says that, if novels were roads, his favorite road sign would be danger, imagination at work, right? And part of what this seems to imply is that the world is what it is. You see it, and you write it. Don't add anything to it. Don't embellish. That's how I'm interpreting his words. And I'm thinking that, when I was much younger, I never heeded that sign, because young writers tend to go overboard. हर चीज पे you want to show off how well you write, तड़का लगाना है, ये सब करना है. In a sense, he was saying that this is a sign that you should watch out for. So how does one balance this? Because I talk about this with my students also a lot, that sometimes you want to, in Naipaul's words, avoid the abstract, embrace the concrete. You want to make something vivid, but in the process of making something vivid, you can go overboard, and you may not have the discipline to murder your darlings, as the phrase goes. How has this been in your own writing? Because when you are learning to write the way that you did, looking at craft, the writing itself is an act. It is performative. It's not just a means to an end, as all good writing should be, but it is also for that moment an end in itself, for you, if for no one else. So how have you evolved over the years in that process? And I must put in the caveat here is that I love all of your writing, from your early books to the Blue Book, which is just beautiful. But you have a better inside view of how your writing has evolved and how you think about all of this, the writer's role in all of this. Because at one level, you want to be faithful to the world you write about, but at another level, the world you write about exists only for you. You are seeing it. It is imbued with the personal. So how does one deal with all this?
Yeah. When I came from Patna to Delhi, when I was, 16, 17, whatever, one of the books, these thin booklets I discovered was called Words Are Important. So usse, it was a sort of a vocabulary or acquisition ka tarika tha wo. And I have to say, the other thing I was doing was कि एक notebook रहती थी. So if I was reading a novel, let's say, I remember reading Thomas Hardy and noting down the word lucent. I think it was Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or word lucent मैंने सीखा. Lucent. उसी तरह word sanguine. The distressing thing about this acquisition of new words, however, was that I wanted to use them rather than, the sky was always the cerulean sky rather than a blue sky. और बड़ी दिक्कत थी उस बात से. I flinch every time I'm reading something by a student, say, and I see that the emphasis is falling on the use of a more extravagant vocabulary. मुझे लगता है this person is missing something. They are missing the wood for the trees, which is, by the way, a cliche which should not be used. But anyway, point is, so my passage from there to something more serious has again been a journey. Now, do I agree with Ian? Well, Kiran Desai, who has given a nice blurb to this book, did write to me and say, I do not agree with Ian Jack. You should paint, of course. You should draw. You should do everything. मैं परसों चौथे रोज यहाँ पे I went for a walk with Ian Jack and we were talking about these things, because I was, he comes from a working class background. So there is a suspicion of everything, of anything that is embellished. And I understand where that comes from. What that also means is seeing you used the right phrase. You said seeing the world as it is. It is a certain emphasis on an unembarrassed plain speaking, and using that plain speaking to get to something incisive and probing. And he does that well. He does that very well. I teach, in fact, I'm next week teaching an essay of his called Unsteady People, which is wonderful. I think I want to be just a little. Well, let me tell you a story about Ian. I don't know whether you have read an essay of mine called Pyre, which is about
beautiful essay.
Thank you.
Essay, of course.
It is about my mother's death. I was writing it for Ian because he was editing a special issue of Granta on India. Okay. There was a little episode in what I submitted to him, which he wanted to cut, and he did cut it. It was an episode where I had said how my mother was becoming frail or debilitated for several years before her death. And I described how we had visited a public monument in some part of Gujarat or Rajasthan, and my mother needed to pee. She needed to urinate. And I couldn't find a bathroom. So, in one particular room of this big abandoned place, I felt it was abandoned, I said to her, I'll stand at the staircase. She was getting desperate. I said, you just pee here, doesn't matter, near that hole. And when I came down with her, there were 2 or 3 men standing near a pawn shop, and they were looking at us, the wetness on the wall above there. You understand? And I said, in that piece I had written that this was very embarrassing to me, and I don't know how much more humiliating and embarrassing it was to my mother. But this is what mortality means. You are seeing death. You are seeing your body weaken. And I said it was very interesting to me. I had written in that piece that on the night when I was sleeping beside my mother's body, which we were going to cremate in the morning, a dream came to me in which a man had said something humiliating at a wedding in a public place about my mother, and that I wrestled him to the ground. ठीक है? एक छोटी सी आपको वाक्य दिया मैंने. Ian said, you have to take this out because you're going to embarrass your reader. And a responsibility of the writer, मुझे बिल्कुल सही याद है जिस तरह से he wrote. He said the responsibility of the writer is to never embarrass his reader. तो ये तो मुझे एक अच्छा सा रूल लगा. I do not agree with it. I think one should bear one's heart, and one should be as honest as possible in one's writing. And this was my attempt to be honest about what had been embarrassing about my mother's decline and how I felt it internally inside myself. So I think he's coming out of a certain kind of an English tradition of not revealing too much, of having a certain honesty, but that honesty is expressed in terms of avoiding extravagance, of being happy with bread and potatoes instead of going in for some fancy cereal. Muesli nahi khana bhai. Bhai main porridge nahi khayunga. That sort of a feeling. It is coming out of that ethos. And so I think one has to be true to oneself. And if you're true to yourself, you will find a form that does adequate justice to your writing. And in that case, I cannot hold it against someone, let's say Martin Amis, born in a family held up for its literary achievement, then goes on to do something that is like fireworks in the sky. Bhai usko, that's his inheritance almost, it seems to me. He can do that. मैं कहीं और से आया हूँ, I have to do something else. You know what I'm saying? It's not a point so much about accepting one's station, because I don't think it is one is better or the other, but of being true, what feels natural to you. Having said all this, I must say, शायद मैंने एक किताब में भी वहाँ बात लिखी हो कि वो I always also feel कि जैसे वो आप टेनिस मैच देख रहे हैं ना, the commentators will never, वो जो soccer में the South American commentator who says goal, वो नहीं होगा. In Wimbledon it will be, now we'll have to see if Christina can achieve it. It will be a struggle after her 3 double faults. She has had 3 double faults. Venus had only had 1. That hush in these posh places or in these games, which is a very controlled voice, वो भी नहीं चाहिए मुझे. So how to avoid the hush that often falls on me when I'm trying to be the English writer, and how to embrace an identity of someone who comes from a place where when the song comes and you're sitting in the theater, men will tear their shirts off and they will sing. You know what I'm saying? तो मैं तो यहाँ पर इस gesture में अपनी earphone भी निकाल दिया, मगर you see what I'm saying. मनोज वाजपेयी would accept कि हाँ, बेतिया में जब वो गाना आता था ना, तो हम लोग तो अपना साला कमीज फाड़ देते थे. चलो First day, first show. So that exuberance also, uh, must say that I feel that I should embrace in my writing that kind of wild energy too. लेकिन हमेशा से हो नहीं पाता है या शायद उस तरह से आता नहीं है. So it is not so much finding a balance, to answer your question. It is just a back and forth in a little dance where you're trying to retain while doing, but while achieving some unnatural postures, you're still trying to retain your balance.
No, you could not have answered this question more beautifully, and thanks for sharing that passage which Ian Jack cut out, because as an editor that would have delighted me the most, that particular passage, because I think it really does get to the heart of mortality and how vulnerable it makes you and how helpless it makes you, and it really kind of speaks to me. But I think the larger answer there is that you have to be authentic to yourself, which is what I tell my students. I tell creators of all types that you have to be authentic to yourself. And even the Englishman who's giving the restrained commentaries, Wimbledon, is at some level being authentic to himself.
Exactly.
Like Ishiguro is captured in Remains of the Day, for example, or is, that classic sort of restraint, and whatever it takes to be authentic to yourself, you do that. Now, that kind of brings this deeper question, because I think the biggest hurdle to writing, and in fact, a hurdle in life itself, is this ever present anxiety of what other people will think of us. We are social creatures, we crave validation, and therefore, in a sense, we are all being performative. In certain ways, we are being performative even to ourselves. You may go from a small town to a big city, or from India to abroad somewhere, and you are conscious of that. How am I being perceived? And you're performative. You're being performative, and sometimes a face becomes a mask. And in trying to project yourself as something which you would like to be seen as, you lose a little part of yourself. Now, what you have done, and this is so evident in all of your writing, in the flavors of the language that you capture, in the places that you visit, is that you haven't done this. But what was this process like? Was this, and this was really an anxiety that I only noted in myself, in a sense, when I reached middle age. When I realized ki, boss, we spend too much of our lives paralyzed by this anxiety, when the truth is no one gives a shit about anyone else. We've all got our heads up our own ass. कोई नहीं सोच रहा इसने क्या लिखा, स्क्रीनशॉट लो, इसको ट्विटर पे मॉक करो. Actually, that ट्विटर पे बहुत होता है. But otherwise, it's such a pointless anxiety and something you have to move past. So what was that process for you like? You were a small town kid who goes to a big city. You were a desi kid who goes abroad. And this must have been an ever-present anxiety. It must have at some level shaped your writing. Even when you begin writing, there is that Indian writer in English thing happening. There are those big role models. Even you, I'm sure, would like a fat advance. Maybe not consciously, but the thought must enter कि कैसी book है जिसको advance मिलेगी. So on and so forth. Tell me about this anxiety. Has it played a role in your life? How have you overcome it? When did you begin to see it for what it is?
I have not overcome it, boss. I still crave good reviews and get angry or disappointed or disgusted with those that do not offer praise.
But you're now comfortable in your own skin.
सही. मैं just in the interest of honesty, I just wanted to say कि boss, उतना भी transcend नहीं किया हूँ. Have you watched that Chaitanya Tamhane film, The Disciple?
I haven't watched The Disciple yet, oddly, because Court is my favorite Indian film of the last 20 years.
It's an amazing film. सही बात है भैया. तुमने जो कहा ना बात, I'm trying to link it also with your last question about being authentic. You think at one level, Chaitanya Tamhane is someone I don't know. He seems young auteur who is full of both promise and achievement. But I'd love to know him. कोई भी अगर जो इसको सुन रहा है, please tell him that I admire him immensely. You cannot watch that movie, whether we are talking about The Court, but also certainly more importantly, I want to talk about The Disciple, without thinking that here are characters who are being authentic to themselves. ठीक है ना? जैसे वो कोर्ट में वो जो सिंगर है, वो अपनी पूरे सोल की जो पूरा सत्य है उसको वो प्रेजेंट करता है अपने वर्ड्स में. It is an unswerving arc towards his fated destiny. चली आ रही है. It's an amazing thing. It's as firm and as shiny as a sword being swung in the air. It's just there. अच्छा. So you sense that of the characters, but also you sense that of the artist behind the camera. That this person is trying both to express something of his own, what he is seeking in life, what he is seeking in art, and he's trying to shape who he is through this expression. Huh? So my main anxiety is not so much about the advance, which I don't get anyway, or about the reviews, which are not always good anyway, or about finding admirers, though it's great to have someone who has read you as sympathetically as Amit Verma has. It is about doing what that guy is doing. Yeah? जो बैठ के रियाज करता है and finds himself distracted but returns to it because he thinks this is what is the path. I thought, and nothing absorbs me. And this is the one way of answering your question. Nothing absorbs me as the story of this seeking of the self. And the seeking of the self through art, because you can't do it by industry. अगर मैं 1,000 करोड़ का इंडस्ट्री अगर सेटअप कर दिया तो उससे मेरी ट्रू सेल्फ मिल जाएगी, वो तो कभी सोचा भी नहीं और ना कर सकते हैं. So instead, how to find and write a poem or a story or a novel that will achieve, let's say, what I saw someone doing with great austerity even in The Disciple. बड़ा अपील करता है मुझे कि भैया जिंदगी दे दी to the acquisition of the right. And I did not know, like when in the well, you haven't watched The Disciple. In The Disciple, there's a scene, for example, where the teacher says, he's dissatisfied with how the boy is singing. Now, for someone unschooled in music like me, I do not know what is going wrong, but I appreciated the rigor of the master saying this is wrong, and I appreciated the enthusiasm and dedication of the student who says, okay, let me try this again. And it was amazing to me. So the search for art, or the search for a form that articulates whatever it is I'm looking for or seem to have found at that point, and what I can say about the world, that is how I have maintained, or at least found, a place of comfort in today's world.
And do you look back on your older writing? Like, whenever you write something, what you have written at that moment is a reflection of yourself, right? And when you look back on your older writing, do you look at it differently? Do you sometimes say कि अरे यार ये क्या लिख दिया? Which of course I think all writers go through. Everything I've written before makes me cringe. But in your case, you've been accomplished for a very long time. So do you look back at your older writing and think sometimes that this was written by a different person? Like, how different is the 22-year-old Amitava Kumar from the person that you are today, and perhaps a person 18 years ago when we first met or whenever?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
different are these people? What do you see when you look back on yourself? What do you feel?
When I first really started thinking of myself as a writer, I was writing poems against the Border Patrol and in America. And they were very angry poems. And I do cringe a little bit, but I also am quite taken by that person who seems eager to speak in such an unfettered way. My first book was called Passport Photos. मैंने सोचा कि भाई, that was a very, coming to this country was a transformative experience, and the encounters that I had and the feeling of being a marginal man. And I thought कि भैया जब आपको visa देता है, that's a very humiliating experience, when you go to ask for a visa and the way they used to treat you. At least they used to treat you. I don't know how they happen now. And I used to think कि भाई उसने पूछा अब मेरा नाम क्या है, उसने पूछा अब क्या करते हैं. And when you look at your passport, the guy at the border asks you a few questions, again in a very blunt way. Have I ever got a chance to tell my story? ठीक है. So if I open my passport, it says name, place of birth, date of birth, identifying marks. What is the story I can tell about these? So everything that is on my passport, on the first page, those are the chapters of that book. और passport photo भी एक होता है. मगर passport photo मैंने, the photo I've used there is one of you see an old woman And then when you turn the page, you see the photo of that same woman, the same photo, except now it is a bigger frame, and you see that she has her arm raised in protest, and she's a protester from Bhopal outside the Supreme Court office in Delhi. And I was trying to tell the story. What is the story that the passport does not tell? And what is my book, Passport Photos? What is the story that it is telling? In other words, how to take the form given by the state and how to alter it. My passport does not ask me what is my language, but it is in language that I declare my independence and my identity. तो मेरी एक chapter language पे है. So when I now look back at it, I'm rather pleased that I found that form. I'm also pleased by the various liberties I have taken by doing reportage, poetry, photography. I've photographed in 5 different countries, I think. I've covered migrant workers in that book. So I'm pleased with that. But one thing that I don't find of, and that has become more a feature of later books, is narrative. Just कि भैया settle into narrative. आराम से एक कहानी बताई जाए. And that has been the change. मैं पहले I used to, और the other aspect is, मुझे हमेशा लगता था कि मैं स्टेशन पे खड़ा हूँ, एक सूटकेस है, and I will go back to India. उस तरह की फीलिंग थी when I came to this country for several years. मैं तो लाइसेंस भी नहीं लिया because I thought कि क्या फायदा है? I'm going to go back and be a journalist. Arvind Das used to be alive then. I used to, he would say कि हाँ, तुम आ जाओ, नौकरी मिलेगी तुमको यहाँ पे, no problem. And that was a wonderful place at that time. वो दिलीप पदगांवकर, etc. खैर, तो वैसा तो नहीं हुआ. And I stayed here. और फिर I began thinking कि academia में जिस तरह की writing हो रही है और खासकर post-colonial theory में, it's very limiting. There is no search for a wider readership. And so I began thinking, so I wrote Bombay, London, New York, or Husband of a Fanatic, because I wanted to have a larger readership and to have conversations that were a bit more reportorial rather than written from a seminar room. उस तरह की बातें. So that has been one change. By the time, but still it was about India. But when I was writing Immigrant Montana, which was published in India as The Lovers, उसमें मैं सोचा कि नहीं, अब अपनी आवाज यहाँ पे जो है, my experiences, उसका कुछ ऐलान करूं. And so I tried a little bit more of an exuberant language, also a mixed up language, and I tried to write about here. But उसमें भी the कहानी is that of एक आदमी था जो हमारे was from Bihar. During the partition, he goes to Pakistan. And then his name was Iqbal Ahmed. And then he got a scholarship and came to America. And from America, he went to Tunisia and became involved in the Algerian struggle. He was a friend of the PLO. And when he returned to Princeton, where he was a PhD student, he got involved in the protests against the Vietnam War. And then he was jailed for conspiring to kidnap Kissinger. ठीक है? तो John Berger ने उसकी कहानी लिखी थी, but it ended with the time he crosses over into Pakistan. तो मैंने सोचा कि भाई उसके बाद उसकी जिंदगी में खासकर ये किसिंजर का जो वाकया था, I should follow that, and I wrote my novel Immigrant Montana based on that. So from then, this idea of how to bring the two worlds that are most closest to India and US, that has been the main attempt. And that is why, if you look at the British cover of A Time Outside This Time, you will see that it is split in half. One half is Narendra Modi, the other half is Trump, and they both meet in a nicely symmetrical way. तो यही मेरी अब भी एस्थेटिक कोशिश यही है कि इन दोनों दुनिया को एक साथ लाऊं ताकि समझे कि what are things happening similar in both places and not very similar in both places. And that has become now, in some ways, a focus of my writing.
सर भयानक कवर है, वोट करे तो किसके लिए वोट करे, ये आपने क्या किया? तो here's a question. There is at the heart of being a writer, it seems to me that there is a contradiction and there are two aspects which seem to go against each other, and I'll talk about both those aspects. And one of those, I'll read out this bit from your book where you wrote this message to Michael Ondaatje. And you wrote, quote, "My wife called me from her car. She was crying. She had been on her way to the pharmacy that is only 5 minutes away, but something bad had happened. Driving on the dark road, it was late evening, night gathering all around, the glow of tail lights. She had struck a deer. She said she had been unable to react in time and now she couldn't move in her seat. A man in the car behind her had stopped and asked her if she was okay. He then used his phone to call animal control. A woman slowed down to inform her she was offering judgment that the deer was suffering. My wife said nothing to her, but to me she said it was a beautiful animal. After a while, she saw the animal control truck. She told me it had come to a halt behind her. Then she heard a shot and she didn't want to talk anymore. Stop quote. And I love the detail of then she heard a shot, just that much, extremely powerful. And you write in your, and this is again from the Blue Book, and you write how Ondaatje thanked you for the account and he said he had a story for you. And I'll quote this story, quote, a man driving in Dorset was stopped by the cops. He looked very disturbed. The cops grew suspicious and made him step out of the car. The man said that something had happened an hour earlier and he could not get over it. He said nothing more. The cops searched the car, and in the boot, they found a dead badger the man had hit and killed. He was still grieving. The driver was Ted Hughes. Stop quote. Remarkable story. This is one aspect, and this is the aspect of empathy. Ki what happens when we read literature is that, we are born to live one life, but by reading literature, by reading novels, we can inhabit the heads of others and live the lives of others. And that, it seems to me, is something that would naturally build empathy, which is why I can look at various people, such as your two cover models for which you just showed, and assume that they've never read a novel in their lives.
Yes.
Now, the other aspect of this, again, comes from, I think this was in one of your other books that you quoted, Com Toybin. And I'll quote again from the quote, Toybin had told the class he was teaching that, his quote now, you have to be a terrible monster to write. His quote ends. Everything is material, the writer was saying, even confidences that someone has indiscreetly shared with you. Toybin's advice to writers was to go ahead and use the story, even if readers were going to identify the person you were writing about. The writer's credo must be, use it because it will make a great story. Toybin had said, if you can't do it, then writing isn't for you. You have no right to be here. If there is any way I can help you get into law school, then I will. Your morality will be more useful in a courtroom. Stop quote. So these are interesting contradictory aspects which, despite being contradictory, it seems to me must both exist. One is tremendous empathy and the other is basically the mind of a sociopath. कि मुझे कहानी बतानी है, किसी भी तरह बतानी है, ये लोग तो मर जाएंगे, कहानी लिव करेगा. So what are your thoughts? Like you mentioned Janet Malcolm and her thoughts on journalism earlier. And this second aspect of it is also a question that she brings up, that these people you are writing about become instrumental to you. You speak to them not really to listen, to understand them, to empathize, but to look for material. कहाँ से एक अच्छा ये मिल जाएगा which you can use in your story.
I like the point you made about empathy. That's something I think about every day. In fact, मेरी जो last novel है, A Time Outside This Time, it started with a question about empathy. I asked what happened was that it was in 2016, a few months before Trump was elected, और मैं एक college में पढ़ा, I had gone to give a talk in upstate New York, and I was driving back, और मोहम्मद अखलाक की जो लिंचिंग हुई थी दादरी में, उसकी इट्स वाज द फर्स्ट एनिवर्सरी वाज. तो मैंने सोचा कि क्या लिख सकते हैं which will remind people of what happened and maybe make them think a little bit. It was an exercise in empathy, frankly. So the first line I wrote, I was driving, इसी तरह का एक नोटबुक मेरे हाथ में था, एक छोटा सा नोटबुक. I wrote, a lot of life is left in a man being killed. और फिर मैंने सोचा कि जो आदमी मर रहा है, जिसको मारा जा रहा है, what are his thoughts as he is being killed? What does he think? It was a presumptuous act, but at the same time, that is what a writer must do. They must presume to enter the lives of others with an effort to touch other people or to make them think about other things. And then that question got linked to another question, which was that of what can you give a dying man? What can you write that will make someone give a dying man a drink of water? क्योंकि मैंने एक और वीडियो देखी थी in which a man, maybe in Hapur, is asking for water after the cow vigilantes have hit him so badly. No one gives him the water and he then settles down and dies. So I think if you do not think about empathy, you cannot write. But on the other hand, I also think it's wrong to assume that reading will necessarily make you more empathetic. My friend whom I've invoked earlier in this conversation, Teju Cole, once wrote about this and said, "Ki kya, isn't it true that all those people who were the guards or the officers in the concentration camps, did they not listen to Beethoven and Mahler before turning on the gas in the gas chambers? या घर जाते थे फिर? All these officers had their bungalows next to it. वो घर जाते थे after all, after killing people. They would go to their homes and their children, and they lived perfectly normal lives and listened to music. Great achievements of German culture, So there isn't a clear link necessarily between writing, though one hopes there is. Certainly in writing, in producing it, how can you write without having an empathetic imagination? How will you enter the lives of others? So that's a crucial point. Accepted. Does it exist in contradiction with this other desire? Yeah, my friends, including again my friend Teju, disagree with Combe Toybin's command that you have to be a monster to write. मैंने इसलिए embrace किया था उसको because I went with this feeling. I armed myself with this sentiment when I went to Patna. कि भाई, I'm not going there to celebrate it. I'm going there to be as honest as I can. And there was this poet whom I admired a lot. And I thought his marriage was especially difficult. I should be honest in writing about it. Okay? And I had this thought even as I was walking with him in a park in Patna and talking to him. And then I went somewhere else with him. And then I went to a mall with him. I was thinking, ये तो सोचेगा बंदा कि ये पूरी कहानियां मैंने इसको बताई. I was thinking, he must think he must feel betrayed. And then I thought, but that is what I must do. I frankly did think that, and I'm not necessarily proud of it, but neither am I ashamed of it, because I thought that is my dharma, to write what I have come to find out. And I'm sure he was upset. And then when my mother died, he came to her funeral, and I went out, I saw him, we embraced. And then he began telling me a story. And he's always a great storyteller, so I just listened. He mentioned another writer, and he said when he died, and I think the death might have been in Mokama or somewhere, I can't remember, somewhere in Bihar. And this other writer was in ICU, and death was imminent. And his daughter came out and said to my friend, the poet, she said to कि दादा आप उनसे जाके कहिए, I know I cannot let my father die. So my friend, the poet, said to me, तो मैं गया, मैं ICU में गया, और मैं उनसे कहा, let's say his name was Vinod, the writer who was dying. He said, Vinod, लौट आओ, लौट आओ, लौट आओ. He said, मैं बड़े जोर से कहा. And he's saying this in this large public gathering, mournful gathering for my mother's funeral, and everyone is spellbound listening to this man, this tall, bearded fellow, telling the story about calling someone back from the door of death. The friend died, of course, but this was a great story. And I thought, इसको भी मैं कहीं, मैंने तो इसकी पहली कहानी भी बताऊं, और ये भी कहानी मैं कहीं ना कहीं बताऊंगा, और वही मैं अभी कर रहा हूं अमित वर्मा के साथ. भाई साहब की कहानी मैं आपको सुना दिया. So one has to be, I think, again, to talk about Suketu, for example, Suketu always says, he uses that term, a writer's dharma. And I am with Janet Malcolm Boss, कि अगर आपने मुझे अपनी कहानी बताई, तो मैं तो कहानीकार हूं, मैं तो आपकी कहानी दोहराऊंगा ही. So you be careful, Amit, in whatever you write to me in your emails.
No, you would, the kind of person that I am, I don't think you want to write boring books. So उसमें कुछ माल नहीं है. So, but
I'm fascinated. Yeah, listen.
This is why Chandrahas doesn't send you long emails.
It was amazing. I have a very two-line things about both these things that you've just said. One is, I do not understand it, but I'm fascinated by the stories that you sometimes reveal, either on a blog or on Twitter, about your experiences playing poker. वो मुझे, क्योंकि वो दुनिया मेरी दुनिया से बहुत अलग है, मगर it is very interesting, that, and so I don't think it is boring at all. First, second, talking about Chandrahas, this is a story that will probably not interest him because I've repeated it a few times with him, but it was amazing. He and I, probably on the same evening that I saw you, but he and I got into a taxi, and the taxi wala turned around, because I was joking with the guy. He was an older man. I was talking to him. I was joking with him. And he said, देखिए, he wanted to sell us aphrodisiacs. And he said कि ये जो है, ये गोली जो है, इसमें गोल्ड है, ये कैप्सूल में गोल्ड है, इसको आप खरीदिए और इसको आप लीजिए और तब इसकी ताकत देखिए. तो आई सेड कि भाई साहब मेरे पास तो बहुत ताकत है, जो चंद्रहास है इसको बहुत जरूरत है, इसको आप इसको बेचिए. So there was a story there also. Anyway, so let me stop there. Yeah, go ahead.
One of my friends with whom I did episode 250, Naren Shenoy, who is known as a great storyteller. Kuch bhi aap bolo, he'll tell you an incredible story which actually happened. And we always wonder ki, yaar, we have also lived in the same world. We don't have such stories. And to some extent, I guess it's a matter of noticing. But I have lived in Bombay all these years, boss. No taxi driver has ever offered me a gold cup.
That's because they look at you and they know that you don't need it.
That's because they look at me and they say lost cause, kuch nahi hone wala iska. So,
oh my God.
So normally when I start my conversations, pehle ek ded ghante we talk about the person's past, their childhood, growing up, all of that, and I realized we got into all these thematic digressions and didn't touch upon that at all. So we'll take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll kind of go all the way back, to when it all began. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've taught 20 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing. An online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST or about $150 and is a monthly thing. So if you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just the willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Amitava Kumar, whose latest wonderful book is The Blue Book, a writer's journal. And he's written a whole bunch of sort of incredible books. And I want to sort of now know about the journey of Amitava Kumar before he, became the Amitava Kumar we all know. By the way, I was thinking earlier today that I realized that we think of each other as friends. I realized that when you come to Bombay, we meet. I cannot for the life of me remember how we know each other in the first place. Do you remember?
I think I used to read your blog. That's how I came to know you. और फिर हमारी बातचीत हुई होगी और and we have several mutual friends. I think Prem Panikar might have said something, or Nilanjana Roy, or maybe Rahul Bhattacharya. Because तुम क्रिक इन्फो पे भी लिखते थे. So I think maybe that was the introduction. मुझे भी याद नहीं है.
Interesting, isn't it? Again, just thinking aloud, the other day I was thinking that we live in unique times in the sense कि मेरे जो सभी अभी दोस्त हैं, they are sort of friends that I've made well into adulthood. None of the people I am in touch with a daily basis are people who were in school with me, in college with me, or even in a workplace with me. They are all people I have met because of the internet. People like you and I, or all of these people, Prem Panikar, Nilanjana, I would not have met any of them, or Chandrahas perhaps, but otherwise, if not for the internet, it wouldn't have happened. And we are the first generation who are kind of benefiting from this ability to create a community of choice, to say these are my people, whether it's mutual interests or mutual inclinations that kind of bring us together. And therefore, I think the texture of our lives is far richer than if we were born in, say, 1920 and you are restricted by geography. The people you can choose as friends from around you are, it's a very small pool.
See. I mean, that is true. And yet I feel, and I'm saying that just because I've been thinking about it, I feel that that while all that you're saying is true, but even this community of choice is not an unchanging community. In other words, if you think a little bit, internet has been with us for, I don't know, at least 25 years. Let's say 20 years of some, if not email, then at least social media, that sort of interaction. You have indeed made new friends and you have created a new community. It is true. But then now think how that has changed also. In other words, what have been the conditions under which one close internet friend has given way to another? And now why has that happened? If we understand that, then I think we would have a better understanding of where we are going. For example, what was the era of blogs? I don't know whether you remember. I'm sure you remember. When you started Rave Out, I was also one of the contributors to it. Who are those people? Did we feel very close to each one of them? And if not, why? And now, where are those folks? And who are the others who have given way and why? Is it because blogs have given way to Facebook or Facebook to Twitter or Twitter to Instagram? या क्या और चीजें क्या हो रही ये सब चीजें भी मैं कभी कभी सोचता हूँ. And basically, I think since I once earlier invoked the idea of my funeral and ZD's note, I often think who will be at my funeral, you know? कौन से दोस्त आएंगे? And ये भी सोचता हूँ कभी कभी कि शायद funerals में वो दोस्त भी आते हैं जो अब दोस्त नहीं रहे, because they want to honor a certain past and they want to remember who they were in that past. So maybe you and who knows, even Chandrahas will come to my funeral.
Even Chandrahas. क्या inside story है इस even के बारे में? I have to find out from one of you one day. No, you've sort of set me off on a path of also thinking about that. Rave Out, by the way, for listeners who might be wondering what it was, at one point, India Uncut, my blog was on Blogspot 2003 onwards, and then I took it to its own domain. And when I took it to its own domain, I very foolishly thought that itni following hai, let me start some other sections. One of them was Rave Out, where people write about books, music, films, which they like. So they're not reviews, they're recommendations, and 200-300 word, and you were one of the people who kindly joined in. Nilanjana was there, Chandrahas was there, Jai Arjun Singh was there, and so on. And I soon realized I had made a big mistake because people were coming to the blog only to read me. तो बाकी section की कुछ मतलब वो थी ही नहीं. And that's also, you know, when I don't, as far as my own creative work is concerned, I don't think of scaling. I don't think of making it something bigger because there is an intimate space I have created, for example, with this podcast, and that's a comfort zone for both me and my listeners, and I don't want to kind of mess with that. But I want to sort of follow up on what you said about, and I'm thinking aloud because I haven't really thought about it in these terms before, about, you know, how have these friends changed. And I think one of the very dangerous things that social media has done is that it has made everybody performative, especially what you see on Twitter. Or in fact, Jonathan Haidt had spoken about the rise in depression among female teenagers in the US over the last 10 years. And his point was that, look, people said that the boys will go awry because they're playing violent video games all the time. But actually the boys were fine because the video games helped them with problem solving and logical thinking and all that. It's the girls for whom it was a problem, because earlier what would happen is teenage or pre-teenage girls, and I'm simplifying from what I remember or what he said, so forgive me if it's simplistic, but earlier teenage or pre-teenage girls would, you know, hang around in the school or hang around somewhere and they would talk about this or that, and it was casual and it was comfortable. But Instagram and other social media made everything performative, where you had to compete with the other person to portray a certain image of yourself. And this, of course, led to bad mental health issues. Like I think I heard this one story of how these parents felt that Instagram was messing up their daughter's mind, so they forbade her from going to Instagram for 2 weeks, and she killed herself because she couldn't do without it. You know, and
well, you kill yourself even if you are on Instagram, and you kill yourself if you are removed from it. Actually, is that depressing? Yeah,
it's that depressing, and that's one aspect. And the other aspect is Twitter, where the incentives are towards finding your tribes or your echo chambers in on one extreme or the other. And once you figure that out, then you have to rise in status within that tribe. You have to signal, you know, either your purity to the cause. You attack people from the other side. You're always talking to people, or rather, you're always talking at people or mocking them. You're not engaging in dialogue. There are no conversations. Everything is personal. If someone disagrees with you, they are bad. It is not that they disagree. They are just bad, period. You know? And what I think that often does is that there is an incentive to cast judgment. You go on Twitter, you quote tweet somebody, you snark on that person, you feel wise and virtuous and better than the other person that you are snarking on. And this can also affect relationships. Now, thankfully, I haven't lost any friends because of this per se, but I see people I'm acquainted with who are on the edges of my social acquaintance. We may share common friends who will behave in ways online that they would never behave in real life, because no decent person would behave like that in real life. You know, I mean, what is a quote tweet if you think about it? You and I are standing at a party and suddenly you turn to a third person, and while I am there, you point at me and say, see what Amit said, you know, LOL, he is such a moron. And that would be such an incredibly rude thing to do, uncivil thing to do in a real world setting, but it happens all the time on social media. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, in the sense that how, because it's changed the incentives for how we behave and how we perform, it affects friendships and relationships as well.
Yeah, I mean, वो जो पहले बात हम लोग कर रहे थे with Com Tobin, you have to be a monster to write. Well, everyone is now a writer then, and everyone is therefore a monster.
Yeah.
It shows the poverty of, I mean, I don't know whether I should say it that way, but what Com Tobin was subscribing, that ideology begins to appear very pernicious because it becomes legitimate or legitimized behavior. I'm very interested in the fact that, earlier you used the phrase, we will talk about my childhood in a bit, but you talked about the community of choice. Well, you have a community of choice, but you also have an unwanted community then, because everyone is there now in your bedroom or in your living room. Because I was writing a novel about fake news, I was interested in following some of the conversations on Twitter, or on being there at least, or being active there, some sort of a presence. मगर मुझे तो, I don't find it a space of release or freedom or calm or solace. It is some place where I might go if there is an event happening that is that important, just to see what people are saying. But I find it a herd thing, and I find people are, वो जो एक stampede होती है, I find it more of akin to a stampede than to a conversation. I find mass thinking of that sort also disturbing. So I think it narrows the spectrum of thought and nuance and feeling. So I'm not a fan. On the other hand, I don't think one can shut oneself off from it. So I want to keep a presence. And most probably, after you air my show or air this conversation, I'll tweet the hell out of it. So वैसा ही चलता है. Well, we'll talk later maybe about it. I found it interesting that you don't try to think of scale, that you think of an intimate space. And I think that's a smart thing you're doing, because then that whole earlier conversation we had about being authentic to oneself, that also holds sway, because then we realize that you're not trying to structure something or shape something to please someone else. You're doing something for a certain choice community. And that's great. Everyone who appreciated the conversation with Mrinal Pandey, I hope is going to appreciate our little chat, though I have not yet had a story as fascinating as refugee. I loved the stories she told about Shivani and Dharamveer Bharti, and how she sent those letters, how her mother would give her. And I thought of my own children. My God, maybe I should assign them some tasks. Ki bhaiya, isko correct kar do, and then her mailing the... And I also thought, this is a silly thought, but please forgive me. I thought, oh my God, एक छोटे शहर से she would have the article sent. उस समय तो photostatic xeroxing भी नहीं होती होगी.
Correct.
To trust the mail, कि भैया postal service में चली जाएगी एक, अब उनकी कहानी. What a loss would it be if it had been lost? ये सब चीजें मैं सोचता रहा as I was listening to it. It was a fascinating conversation.
It was fascinating, and I think this is also fascinating. And you're right that people who like that episode will certainly like this. I mean, because it's, I mean, these are themes I keep going back to because I just kind of find them so fascinating. But fascinating, kitne baar bolunga? I think, there are tropes on the show that, take a shot every time Amit says multitudes or whatever. Fascinating is one of those things.
मैंने notice किया है double click. Let me double click on that. ये मैंने पहले नहीं सुना था.
I picked it up from a guess. I've forgotten which guess. So otherwise, I would give credit. But and it seems a very nice way. Double click, mouse over. So, ये सारे use होती है. But let's now go back to your childhood. Tell me about that. Where were you born? When were you born? Tell me a little bit about the texture of your days growing up. Because when I speak to someone like Mrinalji, for example, as you would have noticed, I find that magical, because that is a world lost to us. I mean, one illusion that all of us suffer from is that the world that we see is the world that it is, and there's nothing else. And speaking to anyone from the past, from that generation, pre-liberalization, pre-technology, pre all of this, you realize that life had a certain enforced era. There was no choice but me time, because where is the smartphone? Matlab, we were limited by what we could read. यहाँ किसी youngster को पूछ सकते हो क्या पढ़ते हो when they have everything available to them. We did not. हम audio की mixtape बनाते थे तो मतलब achievement होती थी that, my God. So tell me a little bit about growing up and how your view of the world kind of expanded. What kind of kid were you and so on?
Yet I cannot narrate any story from my past without at once, as if on the same page or next to it, see how I have represented it in my books. In other words, this might be apocryphal, but I remember Amitabh Bachchan saying at some point that he would not. And us samay Harivansh Rai Bachchan ji was still alive. But I remember Amitabh Bachchan saying that when his father would die, he would perhaps, and I might be misremembering it, but the way I remember it is that he would perhaps think of all the times he had heard the news of of a father's death, or when he, in a film that where he was playing the role of the son. And what I got from that was the idea that when his real father died, the experience would not be so much empty as much as it would be layered. He would remember these other deaths. You know what I'm saying? Where he had played the bereaved son. So, usi tarah, you're always drawing upon your own past in your own books. I am certainly. The opening, very close to the opening of my book, The Lovers, which was, as I said, published abroad as Immigrant Montana. There is a line which goes something like this: the red-bottomed monkeys climbed down from the tamarind trees, peeled the oranges left unattended on Lotan Mamaji's balcony. So this is a memory from Ara, where I was born, an early childhood memory. In the story, we read that a monkey, a middle-sized young male, instead of peeling the orange left unattended that day, he picks up a gun, a pistol that belongs to the narrator's maternal uncle, and he points it first at the cousin who is lying in her crib, the narrator's cousin. And then the monkey, turning the gun around with a primate finger, thumb joining, pulls the trigger and blows his brains out. Now, there were monkeys when I was growing up. I was born in Ara in Bihar, in my maternal uncle's home. And I had a cousin who was a little younger than me. There were monkeys all around. There was a tamarind tree. It was not a monkey, but it was I, as a boy, who I have been told, took the gun from under the pillow of my maternal uncle and pointed it at my cousin, and everyone just held their breath, not wanting to startle me, till I turned it around and then the gun was taken away. But because I associate, especially because my uncle was an alcoholic and wrought great devastation in that family and other things, I associate that period or that act with this violence that I then brought into the scene. So that is one story. One story which I don't think I've put into any of the books is that, I don't know whether you know, एक astrological sign के अंदर you're born, you are called a सताइसा, which means अब बिहार में ऐसा होता है, तो अब 27 दिन के लिए आपके पिता आपको नहीं देख सकते हैं, और जब देखेंगे, अगर देखे तो अब शकुन होगा, उन पर क्षति आएगी, or there'll be, he will have problems. And when the father first sees the child, it has to be as a reflection or something. I can't remember the story, but I was that kid. So when the story was told to me, I immediately thought, okay, I must, of course, be a malign presence in the life of my family, and especially because I was a very bad student, I thought, of course I am, because, I brought such disgrace to my father, who, after my 10th grade exams, came to the door and said, अब क्या करोगे, रिक्शा चलाओगे पटना में, क्या करोगे, अब तुम ही सोच लो, डॉक्टर इंजीनियर तो तुम बने नहीं, कभी नहीं बन सकते हो. So anyway, so for 27 days, my father could not see me. He was a young magistrate at that time. And then he came to see me, and I believe he first saw me as a reflection in a small pool of oil. And that's how our alliance began as father and son. I was a great disappointment to my parents because I had a very erratic academic performance. I was all right in college, in school. मगर जिस तरह का होता है bad luck, when I came on a scholarship to Delhi and I studying in modern school, मैं अंग्रेजी में कम से कम बहुत अच्छा था. और वो जो एक एग्जाम के पहले एक प्री एग्जाम किस्म की एक एग्जाम होती है, उसमें I got the highest marks. But when the 12th standard exam जो CBSE जो इम्तिहान दिया तो उसमें मुझे अंग्रेजी में they gave me 53 marks, which was a great shock. I was going to do a BA in English, but with 53 marks में क्या करता? They allowed, if you paid 250 rupees or something, I can't remember, they allowed you to, it was called a reassessment of some kind, I can't remember the formal term, मगर मुझे याद है मैं इंद्रप्रस्थ गया, NCERT का ऑफिस है, whatever, CBSE का जो ऑफिस था, and I filed that application, but I could not improve my grade. वही रहा 53. तो बड़ा शौक था. तो my father said कि भाई अंग्रेजी में तो बहुत कम आया पैसे मार्क्स तुमको. And as luck would have it, मैं इंडिया में टॉप कर गया पॉलिटिकल साइंस में. तो my father said कि आप पॉलिटिकल साइंस पढ़िए. तो मैं भी बड़ा डिसअपॉइंटमेंट और रेज में पॉलिटिकल साइंस पढ़ने गया. I never did well. It was very embarrassing. I also found as I have mentioned earlier, I found my teachers disappointing. Yeah, by the way, I should also mention, people will, I think it was a friend of Jay Arjun's or someone who on Facebook wrote against me on this point too, or maybe, I can't remember now. I was invited by Hindu College, where I was a student, to come and give a talk after my book, Bombay, London, New York came out. तो मैं गया और in a spirit of honesty मैंने कहा कि भाई ऐसा है. There were students, there were teachers whom I had known myself. There was the principal sitting in front. मैंने कहा my teachers here failed me. Nothing that I was taught here ever connected with what was happening on the street outside. बाहर में मैं बस पे बैठा हूँ और we pass शमशान घाट जहाँ पर मैं देखता था fathers taking small bundles to be buried. बड़ी गरीबी बाहर और अव्यवस्था, corruption, तरह की tragedies happening. Bhopal tragedy happened at that time. I said, and then I would come to my classroom. I was studying political science. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau नाम तो लेते थे, लेकिन कभी एक ने, no, not one teacher in a lucid way connected what we were learning to what we were seeing in the street outside. When I was saying all this, the principal first walked out, then a few teachers walked out. The students seemed to be enjoying it, but a couple of the students didn't. And I remember one of the students complaining about it on one of the malls, that she felt that I was being an arrogant asshole. But I don't know. मैं एक दिन जितना मेहनत करता हूँ अपने क्लास में अपने स्टूडेंट्स को पढ़ाने में, I think these people had not done it in a year. When they would lift their notes, when they opened their notes to read out their lectures, little bit, the notes were so old that little bits would flake out like dandruff. तो मुझे तो बड़ी disappointment थी उस education से, and I therefore did not, and partly of course it was my failing. I wanted to be a writer at that time, or even the nights before the exams I was reading, I don't know, works of literature. I remember one day trying to be reading Herzog. अगले दिन exam थी, मुझे कोई idea ही नहीं था. It was a sad experience during education, the seeking for literature, of language, but not finding it in the classroom anywhere. A couple of things I did at that time which helped me was, India International Center में विदेशी films दिखाए जाते थे, और प्रगति मैदान में there would be retrospectives. तो श्याम बेनेगल के फिल्म्स फॉर एग्जांपल मैंने वहाँ रेट्रोस्पेक्टिव में देखी, गुरुदत्त, सत्यजीत राय, और इंडिया इंटरनेशनल सेंटर में रेनवार, ट्रूफो वगैरह, गोदा, और तो बाय द वे प्रगति मैदान में तो फलकनुमा में बाहर बैठ के फ्री रहता था या बड़ा नॉमिनल टिकट, और नीचे एक और क्या, आई कांट क्वाइट रिमेंबर द नेम ऑफ द थिएटर बिलो दैट, बट इन India International Center, you could enter only if you're a member for these films. तो मैं बाहर खड़ा था और passing guest से पूछा था मैं आपके साथ आ सकूं. It was like being a beggar, really. And some people took, offense at it. The other people were very kind. There was an IPS officer, a South Indian man. He would see me and he would let me come. We never spoke, but he would say, "Okay, come." I wonder what his name was. I'm forever grateful to him, because मैं film देखता था. ऐसे ट्रूफो के फिल्म देख रहे हैं, and I look at two characters, they are on a bicycle, they are biking, वो music है, and I would think things like, इस तरह से narrative की जाती है, rhythm होता है, या something like that. Or there would be a cut and I would think, this is how you edit something where you can introduce a certain tension or surprise. So that was my real education, कि ये library में गया या वगैरह. I really think that many people are natural born artists, or they do things that is amazing at a very early age. मेरा वैसा कुछ नहीं था. It has been a long, hard struggle through unknown roads to arrive at a place where one can at least put down on one page a certain testimony of what one sees around oneself. The other thing that happened was that I came abroad. And here, finally, I was able to do. I had already done an MA in linguistics in Delhi University. That's when I applied. And then I did an MA in literature. तो यहाँ पर आके मेरी academic career जरा बेहतर हो गई. In fact, I started getting 4.0. तो, with a nice marks like that, etc. मेरे advisors ने यहाँ पर कहे कि भाई you should do PhD. और मैंने I had thought कि भाई मैं 2 साल रहूंगा, कुछ रीडिंग वीडिंग करूंगा, फिर वापस आके जर्नलिस्ट बन जाऊंगा टाइम्स ऑफ इंडिया में. मगर आफ्टर द MA the teacher said नहीं आप PhD कीजिए. तो अब वो PhD में then you get sucked into a routine and a different life. And I thought, no, I'll be an academic. And, I became an academic. But on one hand, there's no argument against learning. On the other hand, it also delays the actual act of creation. PhD के बजाय भैया किताब लिख देते तो बेहतर रहता मेरा ख्याल से, So I always feel that as a loss. I also feel the loss of, as I have said before, the language was lost to me when I stopped writing in Hindi. But I also feel as if India's connection टूट गया. So the idea of going back and doing journalism, आपने कई बार नाम लिया husband of a fanatic का, it was a useful thing. For example, husband of a fanatic started this way. It was Kargil war. I got married to a woman who was from Pakistan during the Kargil war. And I wrote a piece because India and Pakistan were playing cricket in the World Cup at that time also. And someone was wearing a sign that said cricket for peace. तो मैंने सोचा भैया जिस दिन शादी हुई कि मैं एक क्विक पीस लिख दूं, मैरिज फॉर पीस. और वो मैंने हिंदू में छापा और मुझे एक राइट विंग ने ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, हिंदुत्व ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने एक हिट लिस्ट पर डाल दिया. तो वहां से एक कहानी शुरू हुई. नाउ regarding journalism, one thing I did was that I went to my school in Patna and asked the kids whom I have not known, but it was my school. I went and said कि भाई आप लोग आपकी तरह ही आपके उम्र के, can you write letters to children in Pakistan? And the letters they wrote, some of them were full of hate, some were full of love. And then I, thank God, got a visa to travel to Pakistan, बड़ी दिक्कत से मिली. And I went to my wife's school in Karachi and I read out the letters. And I had the Pakistani kids write responses. Now, I'm trying to say to you that by employing a certain degree of creativity in journalism, I was able to reduce the distance that always threatened to divide me from my origins. जैसे अब जयपुर, जैसे गुजरात में राइट्स के बाद जाना या कश्मीर जाना या कहीं और जाना या झारखंड जाना और थोड़ी सी इन्वेस्टिगेटिव स्टोरी करना. Yeah, if I think about this book that I was holding up a moment ago, Time Outside This Time, going and trying to investigate or write about the killing of a guerrilla leader, एक नक्सल की मौत basically, on meeting the police informant or meeting police officers वगैरह, उससे लगा जैसे कि मैं I'm bridging a gap, not necessarily becoming Indian, but at least trying to find out a little bit about what I have missed out over the years by being abroad. And that has been the story in some ways of a formation where a mix of memory and a mix of reportage has led to a few narratives, which we have discussed so far.
Lots to double click on, as the phrase goes, in all of this. But before that, I want to sort of address another question, and I'll read out a bit from Husband of a Fanatic, in fact. And in that you wrote, quote, in Raza's Adha Gao, and you're referring to Rahim Mazum Raza's famous story Adha Gao, and you write, quote, in Raza's Adha Gao, the protest against the nation is made in the name of the village. When the fiercely well-educated Muslim students come to Gangali to preach about partition and the necessity for the creation of a new nation of Pakistan, the Muslim villagers are genuinely bewildered. One of the villagers is a young man called Tannu who has returned from battle fighting for the British in the Second World War. He argues against the urban visitors in the name of his village. And now you're quoting him. I am a Muslim, but I love this village because I myself am this village. I love the indigo warehouses, this tank and these mud lanes because they are different forms of myself. On the battlefield, when death came very near, I certainly remembered Allah, but instead of Mecca or Karbala, I remembered Gangali. Stop quote. And I found this so moving, and I want to ask you, what is your Gangali? What is home to you? And I asked that not in the sense that I want a definitive answer, because in my own case, I don't have a definitive answer. It was, my sense of home was contained in people and memories and things which have kind of drifted and dissipated. So in a sense, I feel homeless. There are places where I'm more comfortable than other places. But I don't think I have a Gangali. So I want to ask you, what is your Bengali, or what has your shifting notion of home been?
I think those people are very lucky who have a Bengali. And that luck is part of an ethos and is a part of a time that is now gone. Ab Bengali hai nahi. People like my father, it has been very difficult for me to convince my father to sell off the small bit of land that we have in the village. His connection to it is almost as if a connection to an umbilical cord. I mean, he's going to remain and it connected to it, and he doesn't have a life outside it. There will always be certain scents, certain sounds, certain tastes that make me feel as if, oh, I'm more alive now. ठीक है, मेरा एक पर्टिकुलर काइंड ऑफ पराठा और एक पर्टिकुलर काइंड ऑफ अचार से वही रिश्ता है बिकॉज मुझे लगा कि हाँ भाई ये ठीक है, यू नो. एक तरह का, यू नो, रवीश कुमार से हमेशा बात होती है कि भाई आइए आइए मांस खाइए या मछली खाइए, you know, a particular kind of, or this also because I've invoked Maharaj Vajpayee before, the idea in Champaran of a certain kind of khassi ka mas, you know, a goat meat, is important for a class or a caste of people. We're not from the same caste, but you know what I'm saying is that the idea is कि भाई वो, that is a genuine homecoming. ठीक है? The most honest answer I can give you is my Bengali is the printed page on which I have created my own temporary map of the Bengali, of my past and my future. Language is the only nation that I can now commit myself to. Does that make sense to you? And I say that particularly while noting that Rahi Masoom Raza's protest is against the idea of a narrow nationalism. And you and I, boss, are living in a time where nationalism, a resurgent kind of hyper-nationalism, has once again staked its claim on our psyches and is condemning lots of our folks, not just to death, but that other death that is hatred. And that hatred that people are carrying in their hearts is very, very dangerous and will change our societies for a very long time, if not forever.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we'll come to that and kind of double click on that as well at some point in this conversation. But first, you've also in one place written quote, in other words, a writer arrives at a sense of place not by mere accident of birth or habitation, but by creating again and again a landscape of the imagination. Stop quote. And this goes back to, sir, ये आपकी किताब से है. I think this must be this must be husband of a fanatic, I think.
Okay. So here's an answer to your earlier question about कि भैया, it's not making me cringe. I'm like thinking कि हाँ, ये तो सही बात बोला भाई. This is right. Yes.
Admiring
anyway,
yourself.
I interrupted you. Sorry. Huh?
You know, and one of the things I've sort of examined in past episodes also is the nature of memory. Like one of the interesting, like I had done this episode ages back with Anshul Malhotra, and I keep referring back to it because it made quite an impression on me. She of course wrote the books about memories of partition, where people carried objects from one side to the other.
Great idea. Yeah.
And while researching what memory was like in preparing for that show, I realized that neurologically memory ye hai ki if something happens, the first time we remember it. But the second time we remember the remembering. And the third time we remember the remembering of the remembering, and there can be a game of Chinese whispers in the brain. So you and I can remember having coffee when we last had coffee, but we might have completely separate memories of what actually happened. You know, and just going to that theme, like at the start of this conversation, we spoke about how when we write, in a sense, we are constructing the self. And of course, a part of this self is memories, is that sense of home that we are constructing in the absence of an actual Bengali, so to say. And that also, of course, leads me to the depressing thought of what happens when these memories go. Which I have seen happening to people, where I've seen it happen to my father, for example, where at the end of his life, everything just goes. And then what is your sense of self? Who are you? And so do you feel that in all your writing, therefore, by being so self-reflective, which is also something I'll ask you about, but by being so self-reflective, by making your own life, by being a monster to your own life in a sense, turning all of it into material, you write about certain memories, but at the time, was it that for you? Or is it that in the remembering you have given it significance, made it something else, sort of shaped an imaginative world which is now your past, but which wasn't necessarily like that then?
It always bothered me that the 1984 Bhopal tragedy did not at all inspire me to take a train. I was 21 years old. I wanted to be a writer. Why did I not get on a train and go? Yeah, what stopped me? I'd never, you know, there's a wonderful documentary filmmaker in India, Rahul Roy. He was my neighbor. Jab Indira Gandhi was killed, he was going and working. He said that evening that he was going to go and work in a refugee camp. I was very curious about what he was doing, but I did not go that night. Why did I not go? So for me, memory has been an examination of the past, but it has also led to, therefore, the act of writing, where I then go to find someone where what I missed out on, or the. So, for example, when I was in school in Patna, when prisoners were blinded by the police with the use of acid and needles and acid. तो समय तो मैं बहुत छोटा था, मैंने बहुत बड़ा भी, I was early teens, I think. But later on, I went looking for those men. ठीक है? And the encounter with those men and my asking questions about what had happened was for me a sort of course, it's, imagination imagination as a motivation, or curiosity as a motivation to shape a narrative which had missing parts. Okay? So that's my first response. It's not directly answering your question, but I'm trying to say that writing for me has always been, and certainly so now, the most creative thing one can do to record memory, to shape memory, to make sense out of the infinite chaos that always surrounds us, And that chaos includes forgetfulness. And that's what I'm doing. Ask me another question so that I can narrow it down or properly respond to you, because I think maybe I have not responded right to your question.
No, I think my question, in a sense, was not really a question. It was a sort of vague and imprecise musing at some level, because what we remember and our self-image, our memories and our self-image are really constructed, in a sense, by us, by storytelling that we do. Now, most of us, we do this storytelling just in our heads in a very ad hoc kind of way. But some of us are writing all the time. And therefore, one, writing leads to greater self-reflection, and therefore there is a greater chance that if you write in good faith and if you write in complete honesty, and as sort of every line of what you've written in all your books shines through with that, then there is a greater chance that you are able to see through the BS, as it were, to
I see.
see see your own role. Like in an earlier episode, one guest has said that what is one question that people should sometimes ask when they're creating something is, what is my role in this play?
I see. Okay. Let me address that in a slightly. I hope I'm not interrupting you. Can I speak about that?
Please.
यार एक line है John Berger की, which Arundhati Roy has used as an epigraph to her novel The God of Small Things. Kiran Desai has used the same epigraph in Inheritance of Loss, and Michael Ondaatje has used that same epigraph in one of his books. That line is, no story can be told as if it were the only one. And you have, of course, during this conversation, come to it in a different way when you were quoting earlier this line in a different way. Now, I think the desire for honesty or meticulous accounting is one thing, but it cannot proceed with the complacency that you are telling the whole truth. Okay? And therefore, my addition to the line you quoted is, what is your role in the play, is instead would be more like, what is the story that you're telling about yourself maybe hiding, or what does it exclude? And you cannot always be aware of that. And so I have just finished a novel actually, which has now gone out to publishers, and let's see who publishes it and who accepts it, in which I have tried to tell a story, which is the father's story, and then have the daughter's story, just as a way of thinking, what gets left out so often in each of our narratives. जब हस्बैंड ऑफ अ फैनेटिक पब्लिश हुई थी तो कुछ लोगों ने रिव्यूज में लिखा है, या कम से कम एक या दो लोगों ने, कि भाई इसमें तो इस बंदे की कहानी है, इसमें हस्बैंड की कहानी है, वाइफ की कहानी कहाँ है. नाउ आई डिड नॉट थिंक इट वाज माय जॉब टू टेल द वाइफ स्टोरी. लेट माय वाइफ टेल हर स्टोरी. ठीक है, बट इट वुड बी गुड, एंड आई होप आई हैव मेड स्पेस फॉर द पॉसिबिलिटी दैट the reader knows that there is this other story. I tried to do it. I have tried to follow a certain ethic. I went to meet a man who had put me on a hit list. When I called him, he said, "हाँ हरामी, हम तुम्हारा नाम जानते हैं, तुम आओ." I said, "I want to meet you, sir." And he said, "हाँ रे कुत्ते," वगैरह वगैरह. Now, when he was talking, my wife was worried at that time. When I was talking, my wife had said कि जब वहां से आओगे, क्योंकि the police had come to my house to say that you blah blah, this was in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. So मैं जब उससे मिलने गया न्यूयॉर्क में, तो मेरी बीवी ने कहा था भाई कि आप जरा फोन कर लें हमको. तुम तो शायद पढ़े हो ये बात, मैं आपके लिसनर्स के लिए बता रहा हूँ. सो माय वाइफ हैड सेड कि प्लीज कॉल मी. तो उसमें सेल फोन का जमाना नहीं था. आई कॉल्ड फ्रॉम अ पब्लिक फोन और मैंने कहा कि तू बड़ा गाली दे रहा था, तुम्हें भी. ही सेड सम वेरी वायलेंट वल्गर थिंग्स अबाउट यू. My wife is a very straightforward, is a straight talking person. मेरी वाइफ ने कहा, वो जब इससे बातें कर रहा था तो तुमने क्या कहा? What did you say? And I had to say that, I said nothing. I actually just tried to take notes. And I tried to tell myself, even as we were walking and he was saying things like, you fuck her and you fuck Islam through her. I was thinking, I must remember these exact words. ताकि मैं भूलूं नहीं, because, and was I being a good person? I don't know. But I thought I was doing my job if not only did I listen to him carefully and write it down carefully, but I also revealed to my reader that my wife had this question and that I did not have a satisfactory answer for. And that I am now telling you the story. Let me give another example, if you don't mind, from Husband of a Fanatic. I had gone to these camps and I spoke to these women, and I was struck by the fact that there had been so much violence, that the understanding of the children had been so changed that if you asked someone, I have this little account there of a girl being asked, what is rape? And she says, "Main bataun didi." And she says that rape is when you tear off the clothes and throw the girl on the fire. And I spoke to women who had been raped. It was a great responsibility to both listen and then transcribe and write down what they were revealing about their experiences, including what they were trying to shield me from and shield themselves from. Okay, I recounted a little experience where a man asked me, "Who has given you my number?" The previous night I had been to a dinner where I had asked, because a Hindu woman had been killed for protecting her Muslim lover, I asked at the dinner, "Do you guys know of any couple from the both religions?" And this gentleman, whom I can reveal now because he's dead, it was Pratik Sinha's father, Mukul Sinha, a wonderful human rights lawyer. He gave me a number, but he said, "It is dangerous. Do not mention that I gave it to you." And so I called this number, and the man wanted to know who gave you this number, because these are, and I had to lie. I said, "I don't know who he was. I met him at a party." Now, I thought I should tell this story, and tell this story in order to reveal how I got a story and what happened in the story. But when I read this chapter out at the University of California in Riverside, where they were considering me for a job, a woman said, "This man lies. Not only does he lie, he tells you that he has lied. We should not give him a job." I did not get the job. I didn't particularly want it, but I'm telling this to you, that people, even when you are being honest, and my desire has been to be honest on the page always, and of course there must be failings, but I'm saying that has been my desire and my purpose. People will not necessarily give you credit. They'll think that if you have admitted to lying, and you have admitted to lying, and if you have done this on the page, then you must be a liar and must be condemned as such. So there are pitfalls of such honesty, but I'm okay with that, because the page on which you try to be honest should be an open page. It should be open to the interpretations of different people, and you should be held in judgment. It's all good. It's all good. It's all good. It can't be fixed. It should remain an open idea.
First of all, what you mentioned about at the Shah Alam camp, then you ask a 9-year-old girl, what's the meaning of balatkar? And I'll just read her response out in Hindi because I think it's just more sort of evocative that when she says, मैं बताऊँ दीदी, बलात्कार का मतलब जब औरत को नंगा करते हैं और फिर उसे जला देते हैं. Stop quote. And later on, you write, and I'll quote you again. When I began to speak in the Shah Alam camp to an 11-year-old boy whose name was Raja Bundabhai Qureshi, when Raja told me his story, a terrible story of his mother and sisters killed, I saw from the way in which he recited the details that in the name of charity and the need for news, this little boy had been turned into an automaton or an agony machine. Insert a coin into the slot and hear a recitation about rape. And later on, at one point, I think, right in your last chapter before you write about the Bhagalpur blindings, you speak about this village called Logan, where there is this young Muslim man called Nazim. And, Hindus from neighboring villages and everywhere come and they basically slaughter all the Muslims in the village. He manages to get away. Later he comes and all the Muslims had gone to these fields where they were slaughtered, and he manages to identify his wife's body by the clothes that she's wearing and all of that. Deeply moving story. And at this point you imagine, how can he go on again? What happens is 7 years after this, he's got a second wife. He's living in the same village around the same people who, and I'm just struck by that normalization in both these examples, where in the one case, this little boy has seen his loved ones being killed, but he recites it like an automaton, like an agony machine, as you put it so eloquently. And on the other hand, there is this person where everything has been destroyed. And putting myself in his shoes, I find it hard to imagine how I could go on. But he goes on. Everything is normal again. And you refer to the times that we live in. We see this again and again around us, as if there is an acceptance that life is tragic and shit happens, and you just go on in the same way. So whatever happens, people just kind of go on living their lives and everything is normalized. And this can lead to terrible things, whether it's Rwanda or whether it's in Nazi Germany or whatever. Things get normalized that yesterday would have seemed extraordinary. And victims accept it as well, that when everything is uprooted and gone. So in a sense, it's almost as if two opposing forces, where as a journalist, as a writer, you come to talking to these people in full openness. You are in a sense also bearing yourself in the way that you write, because you're also writing about yourself, and so you've bared yourself in that way. But they are either behaving like agony machines or whatever they're reciting. You're one more person from the press, one more social worker who's come, whatever. Or they treat you as instrumental. Like you talk about when you went to Bhagalpur and you spoke to both the police and the victims of the blindings. One policeman and one victim, both of them asked you for the exact same thing, which was that license for a thela or whatever outside the station. And they were looking at you as instrumental. In fact, the book ends on that very poignant note, which I thought was such a powerful way to end the book, because there's nothing definitive about it, no definitive conclusion you take away. There is a man to whom a terrible tragedy has happened, but he is behaving in this petty, embarrassing way at the same time. So what did all of that make you feel, that as a writer you want to go deeper into that tragedy and the aliveness of the things that happened, but as a human they have just... And again, this is, I don't even know if this is a question or if I'm being particularly lucid or even lucent, whatever that is. I'll have to look that up now. But
lucent means luminous.
Luminous. Okay, I'm definitely not being lucent. Yeah, so what are your sort of thoughts on this? Because this disturbs me a lot. And as much as something terrible happening, it disturbs me that that veneer of normality just falls upon it again.
See, पहले तो as we are talking, मैं जरा lucent का माने, I just want to be sure, especially because if we have presented it on a public forum, I think it has to be light. Yeah, glowing with or giving off light. The moon was lucent in the background. I think Thomas Hardy and Tess had used it somehow about the evening. I can't remember now. Gloaming was another word I had learned. जो आपने सवाल पूछा है बॉस, the response I have is something like this. That young man whose story I had actually, unfortunately, forgotten from Logai, but I remember visiting it. And I remember the story there. I met a woman also whose leg had been chopped off. When I think of that, I think of that young man, for example, that he must have told a story to himself about what his life has been, what it was like, and then the story has taken a new turn. In other words, I want to make a very simple and banal point that he must have a narrative about what has been an interruption. Maybe he thought of it as an obstruction, and then he overcame the obstruction. And then his story has gone forward. Okay, let's keep it in the background there. Now let's come to the present. You and I will remember how on Twitter, for example, during the second wave, your friends were asking for help for X or for Y or for Z. All oxygen cylinder needed there, some help needed there, a bed needed there, plasma needed there, etc. Now, my contention has been, my worry as a writer has been that experience or that story, that harrowing story, will be forgotten by the time the general elections roll around. Not only will it be forgotten, it will be somehow turned by the powerful into a story of triumph. कि भाई हमने आपको वैक्सीनेशन दी, हमने आपको ऑक्सीजन दिया, हमने आपको वही हवा दिया जिसको आपकी जरूरत थी, हमने आपको बचाया, हमने आपको सुरक्षित, we brought you protected to the gates of this new future, and please vote us back into power. And we will vote them back into power. So the normalization that you are speaking about, for me, is a normalization not simply of life, in some ways picking up a rhythm that was there before, which probably happened to that young man in Bhagalpur. For me, normalization is where the powerful manipulate even their worst defeats into a story of glorious triumph. And that, I think, is a huge injustice. और उसके खिलाफ जो राइटिंग होती है उसमें मुझे मेरा विश्वास है, particularly if it can succeed, though I fear that writing can never succeed, because we are not in the business of writing advertisements. हम लोग विज्ञापन तो छापते नहीं हैं, हम लोग नॉवल छापते हैं, and therefore we will fail. We will not, 30 लोग मेरे नॉवल खरीदेंगे और 30 करोड़ लोग उनके लिए वोट करेंगे. So that's the difference.
Yeah, and what I'm also struck by, and by the way, there's one particular sort of tragic story during the second wave which happened to a friend of mine, that both his parents had caught it, and they were in separate ICUs because उन दिनों ICU में जगह नहीं मिल रहा था, and his dad was in an ICU in a hospital called Jaipur Golden. So there were 21 people in the ICU ward. And one day the electricity went and the oxygen machines couldn't work and the hospital couldn't do anything about it. And 20 people died in the ICU ward. My friend's father was the only one who survived. And when my friend met him the next day, he said, "Mujhe marna hai," because he had literally seen everybody around him die. All the will to live was gone. Meanwhile, the mother is in a separate ICU. And this dragged on and on, where every day my friend would be hustling with people, going to the black market, getting cylinders himself, and eventually both his parents died. And it is what it is. Just as, when demonetization happened, I thought, okay, the largest assault on private property in human history, and they have to lose the UP elections. And I was completely wrong there, because I completely missed the point. And I think and of course Schadenfreude had a role to play in that, where the poor thought, oh, the rich are suffering more, which of course wasn't true. But also I think that we have normalized that nothing will work, the government won't work, nothing will work, that we live despite everything. We've normalized that, we are apathetic towards it. So we don't actually connect our vote necessarily in a causal way to the governance that we get, because we have assumed the governance will be bad. And I think that assumption is actually largely correct anyway. It doesn't matter who you vote for beyond a certain point. And for that reason, no matter what happened in the second wave, which I think was worse than the horrors of partition, because partition was in certain areas. In the second wave, every family in this country knew someone at least who had been affected in terrible ways. The cries for help were everywhere. But I agree, I don't think it will have an electoral impact. And my question here is this, that what that tells us is that the most powerful thing in the world is really story. Reality doesn't matter. And of course, you could argue there's no such thing as reality because whatever story you tell, there are other stories to tell. The world is complex. Every story is necessarily simple. ठीक है, but how close or far away from fidelity you are should matter, but it doesn't. We live in an age of competing narratives. The truth is completely irrelevant. And it is what it is. And what you say is that, okay, artists might say that, oh, I'll be authentic to myself and I'll do what I do and I'll write what I have to and whatever, which is fine. It is a noble instinct. And those stories won't win, like you said. हमारे 3,000 लोग कुछ पढ़ेंगे या सुनेंगे और वहाँ पे 3 करोड़ लोग vote करेंगे. So what is your sense of this also? Because like recently I remember I was chatting with my writing students in one of my latest batches and I was asked about the difference in writing fiction and non-fiction, and I said, look, there is no difference. It's narrative, you're telling a story, there is no difference. It's the same thing. And over the last 40-50 years, narrative non-fiction writers have used novelistic techniques throughout. There is no difference. And at another level, I feel that there is no difference between fiction and non-fiction also. So I've kind of rambled. There isn't really a question in this, but you.
No, but there's something I want to double click on, which is that that when you said that people do believe that governance will be bad, if that was true, if such belief was endemic, it would be bad enough. But I actually think it is even worse, which is people come to accept, a lot of people, the majority does, and that's why a government can return to power. The majority believes that governance was not bad and that will even be better. That is an even greater level of delusion. And so it is particularly mystifying and depressing for me that there should be such a faith in the great leader and that there should be such an ideology of hatred for minorities and for others that you can coalesce and unite around a certain idea. And therefore, the hegemonic power of the dominant narrative is even more of a challenge when you think of yourself as a writer. You think, oh my God, हमारी तो औकात ही कुछ नहीं है, हमारी क्या औकात है इसमें, So it's a very, very depressing thing. Now, and yet you have to, मैं तो सोचता हूँ कि what I'm doing, at one level, it is just the act of trying to take note of the news, trying to think of a creative response to it. So I think of the Blue Book, for example, as an attempt to preserve my humanity. Ki bhai, bad things are happening. How do I respond with beauty? And I'm not saying I've created the most beautiful thing in the world, but what I'm saying is it is my attempt to find something which I can cherish and which I can share with someone and say, here is a gift of the date. You know what I'm saying? Ki bhai, I have received news of a death, but on the piece of newspaper that has brought me the news of the death, let me draw a flower. Because April का ज़माना है, April हुआ है, बाहर daffodils भी निकल रही हैं हमारे backyard में, तो why not draw it? So I think that is one role. That of one at one stage, it's a testimony that I am. This happened to me. This happened to my brother. This happened to my friend's father, whose father said, I have no desire to live now. So testimony ho gayi. The other, as I said, is the gift to tomorrow, or the gift even to today. कि भाई आज सोने के पहले आप जाने कि इस तरह से the sunset was on the creek behind my house. कि हाँ, we are in lockdown. मेरे students मेरे ऑफिस में नहीं मिलते थे. मैंने कहा कि भाई I made a sign for them कि office hours, today's office hours, क्या लिखता था मैं? Today's office hours are at Sunset Lake. And वहां पर बुला लिया. तो a gift in the face of terrible happenings, a small offering of beauty. हाँ? मेरी माँ की तबीयत खराब है, उनके बच्चे की तबीयत खराब है, लेकिन माँ रात को एक आरती करती है, and it looks beautiful in the night. So I thought that sort of a thing. And then beyond writerly acts, boss, you think of someone क्या उनका नाम था? हनुमान और हनुमंत नारवाल, and his daughter
Natasha Narwal.
Natasha Narwal. When I think of the young protesting, I mean, Umar Khalid in prison, give me a break, boss. Does he deserve to be in prison? And don't we need people like that in the classroom or out in the streets? Wouldn't he be a great example for the young to think about how to serve their country? So writing ko chodo, leave that aside. To think about, shouldn't we at least stand in solidarity with people like that who are paying such big sacrifice? I think that is our job, to honor that. So I think beyond what we do as writers or something, I want to say, boss, how to lend solidarity to these very brave people, many of them young, many of them older than even me, and think कि भाई उनका साथ तो कम से कम देना चाहिए, कंधे से कंधे मिला के.
Yeah, I'll again double click on a couple of those aspects, but I should also point out that to my listeners that even though Amitava is aware it's an audio podcast, he was showing me all these pages as he was talking about them. So that's
Yes.
rustling that you heard. So
Oh,
sadly,
I
that
see.
is for my benefit alone. But if you pick up the wonderful book, which by the way I found beautiful, and I'll tell you, like one approach that I have for this podcast, for example, is that I'm not trying to just go through space in terms of geography. People will listen to me in different places. I'm trying to go through time. That in 2050, if you listen to this, you get a sense of a person or the sense of how an idea was looked at and all of that. If I have a 4-hour conversation with a person, a part of that person is sort of embodied. You get to listen to it and get a sense of what was going on. In that sense, this book was very enriching for me in a similar sense as well. Like already while reading it, I went down different rabbit holes and discovered different writers. I remember I'd recorded an episode with Shrana Bhattacharya a few weeks ago, a great episode on the loneliness of the Indian woman. That was the title. And my favorite post-episode bit was that she'd recommended a bunch of great books, and I picked up this fantastic book called The Odd Woman in the City by Vivian Gornick. And I loved it so much. And I thought, ki, theek hai, it's like an added benefit, which is why I put so much work into my show notes, for example, that I want to make these rabbit holes available for others. So this beautiful book certainly plays that part, as indeed the conversation does. Though for a moment when you said hegemonic power, I was like, oh my God, ye to PhD saab ke saath baith gaye hai.
I apologize unconditionally for that.
अभी adverb भी use कर दिया. What are your students going to think? So here's a broader question for you. I realize that all these years of my growing up, maybe I'm 48, so maybe for 45 of these years, I was under one particular delusion which does not exist. And that delusion was that by and large, we are a liberal people. Fringe में कुछ ऐसे extreme elements है, but by and large, we are liberal, tolerance है, you can see it in our food, you can see it in our languages, we assimilate. By and large, वो faith था, that, whatever you call it, a shared idea of India that I think you and I at least would share. What I have now come to realize is that I was living in an elite English-speaking liberal bubble. And we are the fringe. And the rest of the country is what it is. And I don't want to pass judgment and say this is good or that is bad. मैं अपने नजरिए से बता रहा हूँ, but it is what it is. And one common trope, almost a cliche on my show, is when I ask guests, and I won't ask you this, but I'll share the question so you can see where I'm coming from, is that whether our constitution, which is actually fairly illiberal, but it's more liberal than society, that is our relatively liberal constitution an imposition on an illiberal society, and therefore can that imposition ever work, or can that imposition itself be called liberal? And I've asked this to various guests and got various great answers. But my sense is that what we see today is that society has caught up with politics. Andrew Breitbart once said politics is downstream of culture. And I think that today the elites have been overthrown, that what our politics is reflective of what our society is. That this hatred and all of what you see around has come from the bottom up. And I was sort of struck by this fabulous quote from Husband of a Fanatic. In fact, when you talk to Mr. Jagdish Barotia, who is this gentleman who met you and called you Harami and Kutta and all of that. And at one point, and you're writing in the early 2000s, so I found this a very prescient quote where you write, quote, "The internet was a gift to Mr. Barodia's propaganda. It made him a better long-distance nationalist. He said to me, if the Hindus will be saved, it will be because of the internet. I send out an email and I'm able to talk at once to 5,000 Hindus." Stop quote. And a few years back, when I was musing upon what kind of happened in India, I sort of applied Timur Kuran's framework of preference falsification to it. Timur Kuran is a Turkish sociologist who wrote this book called Public Lies, Private Truths. And his thing was that people often take stances because of what others around them think. The example he gave was the Soviet Union, right? That before the Soviet Union collapses, no one is dissenting publicly because they think they are the only ones. And then there is what he calls a preference cascade, where people realize that others are also dissenters, and then there is a cascade and it all blows open. And I believe that what happened in India, and a big part of the rise of Hindutva, is that there was a preference cascade, that people would not say in polite society that I don't like Muslims, or a woman's role is in the kitchen, or whatever the case might be, right? And some of these, maybe I am biased and I'm putting a negative spin on it. Maybe there's a positive way of looking at it. But there were beliefs which were not stated openly because this elite liberal consensus existed that these are things you can say and these are things you can't say. And that's fallen apart. And that preference cascade is what sort of caused 2014, one of the things that caused 2014. And our society was always like this. And technology, by empowering individuals, actually empowered all the closet bigots, as I call it, among us, who suddenly realized that they were not alone, that they are the majority. So, is this something that you would broadly agree with? Because you have lived longer than me, you've grown up in a smaller town, and you have kept going back as a journalist, talking to people with an open mind and endless curiosity. What is your sense? That was there a shift in the way we were, or were we always like this, and was this always going to happen?
यार मैं सोशियोलॉजिस्ट तो नहीं हूँ, इसलिए मैं आई कांट गिव अ गुड कोहेरेंट आंसर टू दैट.
But
आई डू फील दैट.
impressionistically,
हाँ, I feel my sense was that it is not that we have become the margins. I feel that the liberals themselves are revealing their bigotry. मैं एक passage पढ़ता हूँ from A Time Outside This Time. Why must one slow jam the news? Because all that is new will become normal with astonishing speed. You will go to visit your father and discover that he has pledged himself to the service of the great leader. Or you will visit your friend's house and it will take a minute or more to realize that a meeting is underway. And now, everyone is looking at you with suspicion. You notice one fine day that all the signs on the road have changed. Your town has a new name. Dogs have grown fat on flesh torn from corpses lining the street where you grew up. The beautiful tree outside your window is dead, has been dead for some time, and has, in fact, just now burst into flames. तो मैं नहीं जानता हूं क्यों यह बदलाव हुआ है. I do not know why these changes have taken place. But I certainly know these changes have taken place. They have taken place in our own homes, and they have taken place in our own families. It's a big change. Your question is whether it was always there, and I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it was, but it is startling and shocking. And I don't know also whether it is reversible. It's like the fucking climate change, boss. It's been massive. It's an ushering into a new era, and you don't know whether it can ever be turned back. The glaciers of our not to be utterly glib, but the glaciers of our understanding are melting, and the waters are rising.
That's a fascinating way to put it. And I love that passage, by the way. And I'm also really glad that when you spoke of the beautiful tree catching fire, you did not say it had turned lucent, which no doubt it had. But so just, this is all very depressing stuff. So I want to provide a little bit of light relief at this moment. And I plan to start the episode with this. But before we get back to the serious subject, I'll quickly go to the light relief, which is that a few days back I tweeted, and I will put this link in the show notes also, about a narrative device run by AI, right? Where this guy created a site, or usme you feed in 2 words, and it'll create a short story out of those 2 words, right? A nice little writing prompt. But my God, this fucking AI, sorry for the language, is so mind-blowing. that I think at some point humans will just stop writing novels. Now there are
क्या नाम है उसका?
मैं आपको लिंक भेज दूंगा.
okay, ठीक है.
It's on a particular site. It's a complicated URL.
हाँ, ठीक है.
But since you were coming in your honor, I fed in Amitava Kumar and rats as my two entries, and the story it came up with was this. Amitava Kumar loved rats. He would take them in and care for them, and they would always return the favor, giving him food and love. One day, a rat named Rani came to Amitava Kumar and said, "I know you love me and I love you too. Please let me stay with you." Amitava Kumar was so moved by Rani's words that he allowed her to stay with him, and the two of them lived happily ever after.
क्या बात है?
And there's another one where instead of feeding in Amitava Kumar and rats, I fed in rats and Amitava Kumar. And the story I got, and it creates unlimited ones. So if you feed them, then you'll get something. Rats and Amitava Kumar, and this is a story. Rats were always a nuisance in the Kumar household. They would chew through cables and pipes and disturb the peace at night. But even more than their destructive behavior, Amitava Kumar was afraid of rats. He could never understand why they seemed to bite him, despite the fact that he was constantly running and squeaking.
क्या बात है? अच्छा, now let me tell you a story.
बोलो.
I was in my home in Pennsylvania at that time, and I got a call from David Davidar. And he said, we are doing a series on cities. We would like to start with Patna. It will be a short it will be a short book, maybe 30,000 words. Will you do it? And I said, yes, because I thought immediately of the rats that had carried away my mother's dentures. ठीक है? Now, जब मैं rats के बारे में सोचने लगा, and I thought of the rats, then I thought of my sister in whose hospital they had installed, because of the presence of so many rats, they had installed a machine to frighten the rats. But the rats, as you know, I've written about that in the book, chewed the wire and the machine stopped working. It did not emit that supersonic sound. What is of interest to me is that then I did other works and tried, but I was thinking of myself as the rat. So very artificial intelligence mein, the story that really came out was that Amitava Kumar was interested in writing about rats because rats, for example, had destroyed the land under the railway platform in Patna Junction, and the platform itself had collapsed. Okay? But he was thinking there of someone arriving in Patna, and the rats being the spectators of this arrival. But what he was really thinking was about his own departure, his departure from Patna. He had abandoned his parents. He was the rat who had abandoned the Patna's sinking ship. ठीक है? ये मेरी छोटी लघु कहानी है. The interesting story is that the book came out. My mother was there. She was in ill health when the book came out, and a little later she died. When I went back for her funeral, and this shows you why there is intelligence in the artificial intelligence. When I went back for her funeral, I woke up at night because a rat had bitten me on my hand. ठीक है, मैं पटना में सो रहा हूँ, and I thought I was protected under a mosquito net, but the rat had crept in. There must have been some sense or taste of food or something on my hand. I woke up and there was a bite, and I saw the rat scurrying away. And I could see the bite, I could see the wound. It's a small bite, but मुझे लगा कि भैया कुछ हो जाए तो I woke up my brother-in-law, who is a doctor, and he said, go back to sleep. In the morning, we'll give you a tetanus injection. So that is what I got. So I always wondered whether a book critic had taken the form of a rat and bitten me.
That's a brilliant metaphor. And while we're speaking of metaphors, I also love how you used it as a metaphor for caste. For example, you speak about how the Musahars ate rats, and you've described that also, and how it kind of tastes like chicken and all of that. And at one point you wrote, quote, the reason Musahars were looked down on Bihar was that they ate rats. The official believed that if we all began to think about rats in a more positive way, caste itself would disappear and we would no longer think of Musahars as a lower caste. Did this make sense to them? Did they share this official's optimism? Stop quote. And of course you asked this question and they didn't share the optimism because it was just overthinking it, like what, So it's, the symptom is not the disease as such. So let's, go back to the linear path we kind of abandoned and start talking about your writing journey. And by the way, you spoke of your getting bad marks in English in the 12th. I got more in Hindi than in English in both my 10th and 12th. It's completely bizarre. I can't explain it.
Where did you go to school, by the way?
The school was ICSE board. I was in Bishop School, Pune, and my junior college was Ferguson College, Pune, my 12th, which was what, HSC? But yeah, whatever.
How come you were in Pune, by the way?
My dad was posted there.
He was in the IAS,
He was in the IS. He was
Maharashtra cadre.
no, he was Punjab cadre, which then became Haryana cadre when the two split, and then he was director of the Film and Television Institute of India, FTII. So he was there between 86 to 91, which was very fortunate for me because I lived in that little red house you can see from the
Yes,
road.
I've been there. I've been there.
Yeah, and I grew up watching the greatest cinema you can imagine and not thinking of it as art film or whatever. These were just stories I loved, films I love.
Examples?
So, well, I was a early fan of Fellini, for example. You know, E. Vitelloni and Amarcord were my favorite Fellini films, which probably says more about childhood taste than anything else.
And what Desi people whose films, or who were the students there at that time?
I didn't interact much with the students, though one of them was Sanjay Leela Bhansali, whom my dad expelled from FTII because he was an editing student. So what would happen is you'd have these diploma films being made and you'd team together a director with an editor with pura team banate the. And Mr. Bhansali said, I might be an editing student, but I want to direct. And he kicked up a fuss and there was indiscipline. So my dad rusticated him. And my sense always was that you rusticated him on the wrong grounds. Aesthetic ground pe karte to samajh bhi lete.
Very good point. Oh
Yeah.
my God. Very good point.
That's kind of a different sort of this thing. So tell me about, you've landed up in America. What is your image of yourself? Like, did you always want to be a writer, or were you even then thinking ki MA karenge, I'll go back, be a journalist? What was your self-image, and at around what point did that self-image begin to fructify into someone who will write books? And if so, what kind of books? Why? Because right from your earlier books there is that self-examination, that self-awareness where you're always not just talking about what's
Yes.
happening but bearing yourself as well. So tell me a little bit about those processes.
I think the idea of finding kind of an education model in the US, which was very different from what I had in Delhi, was a great inspiration for me. And I thought for a few years that I would like to be an academic. So even but academic writing, because I would certainly say during my teen years, early 20s, my only desire was to be a writer. There was a woman I liked and who wouldn't have spoken for me more than 7 minutes, I think, in all the years I knew her. But my steadfast goal was to be her boyfriend, and the other one was to be a writer. The first goal failed. I did not have the cojones to approach her again and again. But she did admire one piece I had written once, and she came up to me to congratulate me on that. And I later accosted her after she got off from a university special outside Stevenson. I said, "Hey, would you like to read my poems?" And she said no. And then I didn't talk to her again. So because during all those years, I had wanted to be a writer, even when I did enter this more rigorous pedagogical and rewarding model, I thought I should do an academic book, but I thought it should be creative. And so passport photos came out of that. But I was dissatisfied with being an academic. I didn't like academic writing. I certainly didn't like academic conversations. And so I produced a literary memoir called Bombay, London, New York, where I tried to discover in all these places a certain trajectory of migrant travel, but also literature written in these cities by migrant writers, by writers who announced their transitory role, etc. मगर मेरी चाह हमेशा रही कि भाई जरा एक रिपोर्टोरियल क्वालिटी रहे मेरे राइटिंग में. So I wrote works of non-fiction. जैसे Husband of a Fanatic हुआ, a foreigner carrying in the crook of his arm a tiny bomb. I wanted to be the person who, I suppose, brought a scene alive that was drawn from real life and that was journalistic in the sense, you mentioned Vivian Gornick. She's a friend of mine. I was inspired by the way she writes. She reports on life, on friendships, on mothers and daughters, on conversations she overhears on the street. So that was my goal. Magar, at some point, there was the desire, but also the challenge of writing a novel. Or kya hua ki I was finishing A Foreigner Carrying in the Crook of His Arm a Tiny Bomb, which was about, terrorism trials basically in New Jersey and New York of Desis. Because 9/11 ke saath, terror state भी emerge हुआ, global war on terror, and they swept up a lot of desis for minor crimes and trapped them into becoming informants, and also cooked up conspiracy schemes where they could entangle other people and then, claim that they had busted terrorism plots. My book was a reportage on that. But when I was just finishing it, I watched Satya and I thought, okay, who is this guy? Especially when I found out that he was from Champaran. And so I wrote to Sham Benegal and said, Ki, boss, introduce me to this person. I want to interview him. I had thought, especially because then in an interview, he had been very candid. He had said things like, pee in bed when I was a boy and was reprimanded for it. I thought, oh, this man will be frank and open. And I thought I would write a non-fiction book. And then David Devidar used to be the editor of Penguin Random House Canada at that time. In Toronto, when we met, I told him that, boss, I've been meeting this guy. I've done interviews with him in Atlanta. I've now gone to his village in Bihar. I'm meeting him now in Bombay. And he said, why don't you? And I was telling him what I felt that I had gotten access to, but also how I did not feel it was a book length thing. And David said, why don't you make it a novel? So I thought, okay, so why not introduce other characters around this figure who comes from a small town, Betia in Bihar, and becomes a star in Bollywood? Why not surround him with other figures? And then I wrote a novel. And I called it Home Products because I thought many of the novels I was reading, especially by Indians living abroad, were not really home products. They were for export only. So there is Bhojpuri also. There are little essays on train travel, etc., and what trains mean in the Indian imagination. There is mini essays on Virender Sehwag, everything in it. मैंने सोचा कि भैया, to a desi reader, how to make a piece of imaginative writing intelligible. Now, the challenge that fiction posed for me, boss, was that of invention. To hew close to life, but then to invent things. And here I'm going against what you tell your students, which I think you're right in telling them, that there is not so much of a distinction between fiction and non-fiction. Both of them are narratives. You're making up a story. I agree with that in principle. But also how to invent things. This challenge has appealed to me once I started writing that novel. And then I wrote another novel called Immigrant Montana, or The Lovers. And then I wrote this other one called A Time Outside This Time. And now I've written another one called My Beloved Life. The idea of writing something close to life, I've always quoted Jeff Dyer, who says, I write only an inch from life, but all the art is in that inch. That is what one must teach oneself and one must teach one's students. How to be artful in that clever manipulation, in that little spot of maneuvering that is that 1 inch. And in the novel, I'm just trying to widen that inch a little bit more and produce things on the page that are entirely from my imagination. And I'm finding that a wonderful challenge. How to invent. How to invent while hewing very close to life. Take real life events, take some real life characters, but begin, instead of being faithful to the real that has happened, be faithful to the real that is even more real. That is my challenge, and that is what I'm trying to do in this fiction now.
To sort of make it clear for the listeners, can you give an example of something that happened in that inch? Maybe from a book that you have loved, maybe from your own work or whatever, but something that happened, and then what happened in that inch that elevated it to literature or art, or that really, struck with you in a sense.
Yeah, give me some time because if though examples...
An example actually came to my mind of that inch, and it's a very moving example, so I'll share it with you. And it's from a film. And there's this film, I think, by a Croatian or Serbian called Echo. It's spelled EHO. There are many films by that name. This is directed by a guy called Ren Jerka. And in this film, there are two parallel tracks. And one of the tracks is that there is this old man who lives alone whose son has gone missing. And he's missing his son, and there's no way he can get information about what has happened to this kid. And in his aloneness, you see him unraveling. And at one point, if I he's got all these video cassettes and all of that where the memories are, and he takes these video cassettes out, and at one point he takes out all the kind of film in them, and then you have a scene in the backyard where he's surrounded by all this film which is hung all over and he's hacking it down. Almost a literal moment that he was living in these memories and now he's just hacking it down, and just an incredible scene. And again, something that is real, but for me that's the 2 inches where art happens and it goes to a different level.
I was telling you a little while ago of a monkey taking a gun from under the pillow and pointing it at an infant in the crib before turning it around and blowing his brains out. Now, that was an inch from life because it was not the monkey, but I who had drawn the pistol. So, indeed, there was a gun and there was a child in the actual scene, but here it is the narrator who's watching and it is the monkey who does it. And it has a greater appeal for me because the violence, because when he shoots, his brains, bits of his skull and brain are splattered on the pictures of the patriarchs hanging on the wall. And for me, that was the story of familial violence that took place because of what is unseen in the scene. Is talking about the topic of the name of your podcast, the seen and the unseen, is the violence of the uncle who is the alcoholic and what his action sought. Now, in the example that you just spoke about the art film, again, what the inch is that I present towards the end of the book, Immigrant Montana, a still from Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali, and I talk about it being from my notebook when I was writing the novel. So here's my notebook. I have cut it out because I saw an article about his storyboards in Outlook, and I took that and put it out. And then I have a note in it about how I wanted wonderful watercolors that Rai has done suggest to me the feeling of, it's as if a light breeze were blowing through the pages. And it is the feeling of art, immediate and reflecting life. And by putting it into my own novel, I'm trying to say, this is how this novel came to be. So this is that other 2 inches, There's another thing I want to tell you. I thought my narrator is from a small town. His name should be a little bit more provincial. It can't be something like, I don't know, Sanjay. I gave him the name Kailash. Do you understand? It's a little bit different. And then in the train to New York, I was going to see something. And in the train, I thought, okay, this Kailash has come to America. He has an Irish roommate who begins calling him Kalashnikov. Kalashnikov becomes then shortened to AK-47. And AK is also my own initial. Many people in my graduate school used to call me AK. So by somehow, I was creating a little circle which was resonant in a way. It was an inch. It was a maneuvering, maneuvering within a small inch just to produce resonances. So that's what I mean. कि एक intimacy ho with what it really is, but also it is a total act of invention. This idea of the Irishman calling him AK-47 and then it being reduced to AK and everyone in the teaching assistants calling him AK was an act of invention, and it was spurred by what was real, but it is something entirely new. So that's what I mean by...
I had a friend in college whose mom was German and his dad was Maharashtrian, and we used to call him KGB, which was Konkanastha German Brahman. And I'm also reminded of Mark Waugh's nickname since we're into cricket. When the Waugh brothers started, Steve Waugh went straight into international cricket. Mark Waugh took some time, so he got the nickname Afghanistan, the Lost War.
Wow. A double pun. I think I might have read this on your blog some time ago. Something is coming back, maybe?
It's common trivia. So maybe, I don't remember if I talked about it back in the day. But
that is amazing. That is amazing.
And you mentioned Satyajit Ray. And I remember Satyajit Ray would find inches in places where he just kind of, through stillness and not through invention, through letting things happen. Like I think of the swing in Charulata, for example, or the memory game in Aranad Din Ratri, where it's really in his hands the way everything unfolds. And I think there is that inch of art in the dynamic between our two main protagonists during that memory game, for example. And there is that inch.
I want to say something. Wait. I want to say something on that because you had talked about authenticity, and we were both putting a lot of emphasis on authenticity. And now that we have invoked Rai, I want to talk for your listeners, but also just between you and me, a little bit about how art is the real authenticity. Okay? Because we have discussed that chapter about the blind men in Husband of a Fanatic. I have always been a little bit suspicious of the Desi from abroad coming back to investigate and write a story. Okay? So I've always had some anxiety about my authenticity. After I wrote that thing about the blind men, I was having coffee with Ashish Nandi in Delhi in his house. I totally adore him. So I said, Ashish, I'm not sure I've done a good job. Can I read a few paragraphs to you and you tell me? He loved it. He gave it the approval. And he said, listen, think about Satyajit Ray. There is no more of an authentic document of Indian rural life than Pather Panchali. And before he made Pather Panchali, Satyajit Ray had no experience of rural life. Ashish Da was saying, here is a man who ate even Bengali food with a knife and fork, who produced this document. So why are you worried about authenticity? If your art is successful in capturing the real lived life, then you should not worry about whether you are authentic. And I thought that was a great lesson. So there is authenticity, and then there is authenticity.
Let me share with you a lovely lesson I and others got when Prem Panikar did a workshop for my students, our mutual friend. And he spoke about this writer, I forget this writer's name, but he spoke about how this writer was asked, how does he write? How does he clear his head of all the chaos in the world and write? And the writer said, okay, I go inside my room and I shut the door and then I sit down at my typewriter. And they said, okay, then you begin writing. He said, no, don't begin writing. Because even though I'm alone in the room, there are still so many others with me. And I sit in silence till everybody goes away. So the person asks, so then you begin writing. He says, no, I don't begin writing because even if they have all gone, I am still there. And I wait till I am gone and then the story writes itself.
Yeah.
And when you speak about authenticity, when you speak about, Ray making Pather Panchali, even though he probably had Majbhat with, silver cutlery, that, I remembered that. And it seems at one level a bit of a romanticization of an overstatement because the story never tells itself. The writer is always imbued in it, like you are, in fact, in all your work. But I sort of love this story anyway.
Yes.
Let me move on to asking this. And this is again something that there's a shift that I have seen that has happened over the last couple of decades. And I think it is a fantastic, mind-blowing shift with which many artists and creators haven't fully fathomed, which is that we have been released from the tyranny of form. Like in the 1990s, if I wanted to write, I could send an article to Times of India and it's 800 words. Or I write a novel and it's 100,000 or 200,000 or whatever it is. And there are these forms and I have to submit to them. If I'm a filmmaker, I can make something for television that is 24 minutes, into which they'll put commercials and make it half an hour. Or I make a Hollywood film of 90 minutes, a Bollywood film of 3 hours. You have these set formats. What has happened today is we've been released by technology and audience stays from this tyranny of form. Part of this, of course, happened during the blogging days, where I didn't have to think about writing 800 word pieces. I could write 80 words, I could write 8,000, I could put pictures, I could embed a song in between, I could do whatever the hell I wanted. In the cinematic medium, I see on YouTube that people are experimenting with different ways where there is no longer this sense that these are the forms we are restricted to. They are freeing their mind, they're doing their own thing, and great things will emerge out of it. And I think most people, including most creators, still don't realize this completely. There is like a hierarchy of forms in our head where if you are a writer, you think, oh, a book is the highest form, it's a holy grail, and a blog is like very low down, and so on and so forth. And that's not necessarily the case. Now, you're someone who's experimented with form, Bombay, London, New York, or, your short book on rats was a very interesting kind of experiment in form as well. Passport photos was an experiment in form where you're, taking the format of a passport. And of course, the blue book is a fantastic experiment in form. It could be a collection of Instagram posts, as many of these were, right? So, how and so you've always been open to someone thinking outside the conventional in terms of form right from the 90s. So how has your thinking about this sort of evolved? Like, I think, a long time ago, a book like this would have seemed audacious, where it's really, it would just have seemed audacious. I mean, I know Sebald did things with images and all of that, and Calvino wrote A Hermit in Paris, which is really like a collection of blog posts and incredibly charming, but there isn't that much formal deviation going on. And yet you've been open to it and you've embraced it completely. And this is such a lovely book, because while it sort of uses the technology, while it kind of takes Instagram posts and puts them on the page, what it also does is the opposite of what social media does for me, in the sense that it slows down life and puts me in a quiet place where I can be reflective in the same way as you are slow jamming with the news. So what are your sort of thoughts on this, and are there other forms you want to explore in the future? And do you think that your work in a sense is limited to writing, for example? Because one thing I have realized is that what is a creator? You don't only have to write if you're a writer, you don't only have to make music if you're a musician. There's so many different ways now to express oneself.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your kind remarks. I'm so happy that the Blue Book, which was actually initially Himali Sodi's idea, she was starting her agency, a suitable agency, and she just asked me, because I would put my pictures, my drawings on social media. She said, "Can we please use 6 of your, or something like that, of your images on our site?" I said, "Of course, take it." And then she said, because of the responses she was getting, she said, we would love this to be a book. And that made me think, oh, chalo, तो मैं इस पे कहानी लिखता हूँ एक तरह से, to start thinking about different chapters, So here there are characters, there are sections called, if I remember right, oh yeah, there it is: residencies, journeys, writing a novel, postcards from the pandemic, office hours. So I owe some thanks to her. One of the things I have not attempted to do, but one day an editor said in New York, "Can you go to bookshops and say, where is your white literature section?" and then write a piece about what they write. One thing I have not attempted to do is a performance of piece like that. Jaise ki Sophie Calais, I think that's how you pronounce her name. Sophie Calais is a performance artist in France whose books are, jaise ki she hired once a private investigator to follow herself, and for him to submit his reports, stalking her basically. In another one, she asked for a bed to be put on top of Eiffel Tower, and then had people come up and read to her or speak to her aise kuch tha, till she fell asleep, and kept a record. In another one, she follows a guy, and another one, she picked up from a hotel room, if I remember right, address book, and she called all the friends on the address book and had them speak about the guy whose book it was, and then produced a book. That is a much more performative. Us tarah ki cheez involving the body, also involving interaction of a different kind, I have not done, but I have thought about it. Lately I've been thinking, and then I saw that someone else had already done it. I was thinking, इस pandemic में लोगों के सपने किस तरह के थे? What were there particular dreams? And I thought I would start a website where people would send their entries, and then I found out that someone had already done it in America. So उस तरह की experimental चीज performance के साथ मैंने नहीं किया है, and I haven't done an interactive thing with cinema, for example, but I've often thought about it. कि उस तरह से एक छोटी सी piece लिखी, and then have someone make a little visual document of it, which was filmic, and explored some temporality that way. जैसे एक दिन का जर्नल, दूसरे दिन का थर्ड, उस तरह की चीजें नहीं सोचा है मैंने, or they have played with those ideas, but it has been lovely to just think. I think people find it liberating. The idea of formal invention is not interesting simply because it's a new form. It is interesting because people finding something new like that find in themselves an impulse towards freedom. So I hope the blue book does that for people. कि वो सोचें कि हाँ, इस बंदे ने इस तरह से किया है. I'm going to keep a diary which does Y or Z.
So in the blue book, you have this passage which struck me, and again I'll read this out. When I think of my youth, I'm suddenly running down a long, endless corridor. The sun is hot. It sits still, bleaching the bones of the afternoon. The running figure screams over and over, What a waste! What a waste!" As we kind of come towards, we've gone well over 3 hours, and I guess, wrap it up. During this conversation, we've sort of been grazing, and no doubt we'll have more conversations where we can do some more of feasting. But this very evocative image of a man running down a corridor saying, what a waste, also leads me to ask you about counterfactuals, about what else could have happened in your life. Not necessarily regrets, because my sense from the little I know of you is that you would say, I have no regrets, I have lived life fully, and all of that. That's absolutely, what I would expect from you. But in general, one thinks of counterfactuals, like maybe there is a world in which you come back and be a journalist after your MA. You don't do the PhD, you don't teach there. You throw yourself into things here. Maybe you're a vicious colleague somewhere. Once a week, you get on the phone and talk to each other about what stories you've been working on this week. That's one life. There are endless lives, endless counterfactuals, and ultimately we are shaped by accident. We are shaped by the accident of our genes, and then we are shaped by the accident of our circumstances, the things that sort of happen to us. And luckily, I would say that it would probably be part of your basic swabhav to have that curiosity, where no matter in what situation you are in, you are curious, you're open. I would imagine that is fundamental. But otherwise, one is shaped by so many other things moving in so many different ways. So as you look back on your life, is there a man somewhere saying, what a loss, what could have been, maybe things you could have done or haven't done or whatever,
Yes. वो जो तुमने passage पढ़ा यार, I think it's an evocative passage, or at least feels so true to me, because I've gone through, especially during those years of, when I was in my 30s, I did think, what a waste this 20s were, जब मैं college में, I mean, my students in undergrad, ठीक है, मैं undergrad students को जो पढ़ाता हूँ, I teach them, for example, some classes about literature. So they are reading good books every week. I did not do that, unless it was all on my own, and it was of a lower, the speed was less, often erratic, totally autodidact. And the other part is, I was not writing stories. I asked my students to write stories, and they write stories. They write excellent stories, and we revise them, we काम करते हैं. It's a great training. Now, regrets, yeah, boss. What if that girl had said outside the university special, I would love to read your poems? And then, you know what I'm saying? Now, as to counterfactuals, I don't know whether you know, let's say Sankarshan Thakur. Do you know the journalist Sankarshan Thakur?
I know of him, I've never met him.
Yeah. He and I were classmates. His father asked me to write for their agency. His father was a well-known journalist. And whenever I think of Sankarshan, I think that could be, that I would have been doing that because we were together, we would have become journalists. I would be doing that kind of work. The other thing that always draws me is, I think of another person who teaches at JNU. And I think, I would have loved to teach at JNU, and this wonderful social and political ferment. So, and I'm sure some of the radical students would have hated me because I would have been I would have tried to go against the current sometimes. But also the right wing would have hated me because I would have opposed them. And it would have been an interesting place to occupy. And to be interactive with students who are engaged in the world, to be an academic there, where I would feel that I was teaching things that served my own compatriots. I would be involved in the life of the people from among whom I emerged. I wouldn't be teaching a bunch of strangers who do not know how to pronounce my name.
I get sort of that as well. There is so much we could have spoken about the immigrant experience, about our politics, about your experiences in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to talk about, but we've taken a lot of time, and one day we'll do this again, inshallah.
Face,
But
face to face, yes.
yeah, so I'll end with a couple of questions, and one of them actually comes from this lovely section in your book. If kya, everybody should buy the blue book, and if you turn to page 85, you'll find a couple of pages of advice from writers which they inscribed in their books for you, and some of them are great. Like Lydia Davis says, read the masters and at least occasionally read them closely. Yijun Lee says, there is always more than one story. Your job is to find that story you did not start to tell. And then, Jenny Ophil says, if you want to write, don't have a backup plan. Also, always put a dog in your book. And so on. And this is all great advice. But I'm going to ask you, as someone who's, and we could easily do a 3-hour session on this alone, just the art and craft of writing and so on and so forth. I'd love to know about all the things that you talk about with your students. But if you had to give writing advice for people who want to write, and you've described yourself evocatively in the blue book as, when you were at 25, you had nothing to write about. You didn't even have the tools. So you talk about how writing is like waiting. And I think many people who do my course and so on are in that kind of phase where they know they want to be storytellers, they want to write, they love language and literature. Maybe they don't have the material yet. Maybe they're learning to use the tools. What advice would you give to young writers like that? Or rather, I wouldn't say young. It's never too late to start. Penelope Fitzgerald being the great example, and hopefully, I can also be a bit more of a late bloomer. So, what advice would you give to any writers anywhere?
Well, thank you for citing all those folks who have written such advice when signing their books for me. I end that section with this following note. I say, having asked dozens of writers this question, I have now arrived at what I myself want to inscribe in the books I'm asked to sign. Quote, language is your closest ally, and if you align it with your desire for freedom, you will be able to live forever. Unquote. तो एक advice वो हो गई कि language is your closest ally, and you have to think about freedom, because without that, it'll be empty. You're seeking. Think about freedom for yourself, for others around you. But boss, what has really helped me, I always tell my students that any teacher teaches from his or her own example. And for me, what has really helped me is this task of keeping a notebook handy and writing every day. Kuch bhi nahi aaya. If you have nothing to write about, my dear friends, look out of the window and write what you can see. But you must write every day. These days, I've started even doing morning pages. So मैं सुबह में उठ के 3 मिनट के लिए, 6 मिनट के लिए, but I write. Just जो भी है, just to unclutter this. ठीक है? That has been the one thing that has really helped me. And the other thing is, I insist on, is this 10 minutes of mindful walking. I wish I could say that it should be exercise, but I myself am unable to do that, but I should. If you take care of yourself, you become much more mindful. And the body and the mind connection is so strong that if you take care of your body, you will be affecting your mind also. So at some level, this mantra of mine, which says write every day and walk every day, is really intended to serve both your body and your mind. That's how you nourish yourself. Another thing I've been also doing for the past maybe 2 years, starting in January 2020, so now it's the 3rd year, is that every day I keep track of my time. So like every hour, I insert what I'm doing. I just write, it's just one line, not line even, one word, dinner or reading. It has made me so much more conscious of time. So I want to, it's in this country, it is called, in the US, it is called planner. So I just bought that. So these things really have been the most useful for me. And that's what I want to offer as advice to people.
Fantastic advice. And part of it reminded me of, in 2006, I traveled through Pakistan with the Indian cricket team. And at one point, there was an ODI in Peshawar. And from Peshawar, one of my friends, one of my Pakistani friends, did some jugaad. And because I said, I want to see the Khyber Pass. So they took us on this jeep down towards the border. We actually went to the border and looked into Afghanistan. So on the way, we passed these Afridi settlements. Afridi is a tribe which are, and we passed these settlements. And there were these small houses without windows. There were these narrow slits. And my friend said, "Oh, that is where they keep machine guns." I have no idea if that's apocryphal or whatever.
No, no,
But there
say,
were these,
say baat. Bilkul.
yeah, and there were windowless houses with narrow slits. And when you said that even if you have nothing to write about, look outside your window, and I thought, but even that's an interesting kind of reality. Now my final question, which harks back to, earlier you said that if I have 10 books in my shelf and 10 quotes that I will always whatever, and I think it was in the context of one of the quotes that I picked up from your book. But I'm going to come back to that because that is something my listeners and I love as a process of discovery. We're not quotes, but what are, a handful of books, I won't give you a number, but a handful of books which you care so deeply about that you want to stand on a soapbox and say, world, read this. You just want everyone to read it. Doesn't have to be any subject, any whatever. Whatever are the books that mean the most to you? Recommend some for us.
In every day I write the book, which in India was published as Writing Badly is Easy. I offer some writing advice, but I also have chapters on, for example, my favorite nonfiction. And there's also, I use there the quote from William Maxwell that you read out from the Blue Book. Now, some of those books are ones that I would recommend, and I'd also recommend William Maxwell's own novella, So Long, See You Tomorrow. So that's number one. So Long, See You Tomorrow, because you see in it the blurring of the line between fiction and non-fiction. Very small book, but feels epic. It's amazing. A book that was written in light of the violence against blacks in America. And it was a book that was both a finalist for the Poetry Prize and a finalist for the Criticism Prize. And therefore, I like it for the way in which it blurs boundaries, is Citizen by Claudia Rankine. So,
Brilliant book, yeah.
Thank you. So those two. One of J.M. Coetzee's book. Which one it will be, I don't know, but I want to offer a choice between two books, Waiting for the Barbarians and Disgrace. One of those two books would be a lovely book to have to address violence, especially on a social and wide scale. There is nothing as pure as the human voice speaking to you. And Voices from Chernobyl. The author of that is the first journalist to have given the Nobel Prize. So I want to recommend Voices from Chernobyl. Also because what she does, Svetlana Alexievich, what she does is she might be interviewing you for 5 hours or 4 hours, the way you have been interviewing me. But everything I've said will be boiled down to a paragraph or a page. And she rearranges it. So how to get something vital from long engagement and then to distill it into presenting something. So Voices from Chernobyl. I think I was talking about what have been great influences to me. I think that book of poems, Jejuri by Arun Kolatkar,
That's one of my favorites as well.
is also a great way of presenting metaphor, thinking about landscapes and people, or also rooting it in some tradition of India and observance. I'm trying to think, for those who are from UP or Bihar, or maybe even from other small towns in India, I think Vikram sets a suitable boy, not so much in terms of the trajectory of the book, but more in terms of the idiom that it employs in order to present small town India something. I think is a wonderful work. And talking about small towns, let me end by, I think the funniest book that has been written in India is English August. So English August by Upmanyu Chatterjee. I think that's and with such clever satire. And if you want to read the Hindi version of it, it is Shrilal Shukla's Rag Darbari.
Masterpiece. Yeah.
Masterpiece, boss. It so uplifting, so sharp.
So, Amitava, boss, thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I just feel blessed that you spent so much time chatting with me. Hopefully, we can do this in person sometime as well. So, thanks a lot for coming on The Scene and the Unseen.
I want to thank you for talking to me, for having read the work. And I want to thank every person who listens to this for having the patience to please forgive anything that sounds excessive. And certainly if it sounds immodest, it has been a pleasure. It has been a pleasure talking about all this with you, friend. Thank you so much, Amit.
Thank you.
All right.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, head on over to your nearest bookstore and pick up The Blue Book by Amitava Kumar. In fact, if you've gotten this far, you'll probably pick up everything by him, and that's a good choice. Wonderful writer, such an inspiration. You can follow Amitava on Twitter at Amitava Kumar. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Scene and the Unseen at sceneunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Scene and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to sceneunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.